Bienvenue au Comité Sen-
Welcome to the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology.
Eagleton, a senator from Toronto, chair of the committee. And I'll ask my colleagues on the committee to introduce themselves. I'll start over on my left. That's you.
Senator Only from Ontario.
Mary Jane McCollum from Manitoba.
Tony Dean, Ontario.
Marty Deacon, Ontario.
Fabian Manning, Newfoundland and Labrador.
Richard Neufeld, British Columbia.
Rosemary Poirier, Nouveau-Brunswick, bienvenue.
Judith Seidman, Montreal, Quebec, and Deputy Chair of the Committee.
And we continue today on C45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. And our particular focus on the two panels that we have for this morning is medical cannabis. On panel one, I'm pleased to welcome representatives of the Canadian Pharmacists Association, Phil Emberley, Director, and John Tiffault, Member, President of the Association québécoise des pharmaciens, propriétaires. I hope I got that right. Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries are represented by Jeremy Jacob, President, and Tilray Corporation, represented by Philippe Lucas, Vice President of Global Patient Research and Access. Welcome to all of you, and I would ask that you give us some opening remarks. I think Mr. Emberley and Mr. Tiffault are going to share their time. The opening remarks are up to 7 minutes, and we'll start with the two of you. So, Mr. Emberley.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Phil Emberley. I'm a practicing pharmacist here in Ottawa and the Director of Practice Advancement and Research at the Canadian Pharmacists Association. I'm joined by Jean Tiffault, pharmacy owner in Laval and President of the Quebec Association of Pharmacy Owners. We are here today on behalf of Canada's pharmacists, who are medication experts and who ensure that medications are safe and appropriate for every patient that we see. We check for and resolve potential drug-related problems, address side effects, and work with patients to ensure that their medications are right for them. First off, I'd like to say that we are generally supportive of Bill C45. We believe the bill provides the necessary protections and takes a public health approach to the legalization of recreational cannabis. We are here today because of what's missing from the bill. We're concerned about the impact of cannabis legalization on patients who are taking medical cannabis for pain, epilepsy, MS, and other conditions. If the legislation doesn't appropriately consider the medical cannabis stream, it will be a huge disservice to our patients. We're therefore going to focus our remarks today on the separation of medical and recreational cannabis and the role for pharmacists in medical cannabis therapy. On the topic of different streams, there are over 270,000 patients registered to obtain medical cannabis in Canada. These patients have unique needs that differ from those of recreational users. Medical users might need strains and forms to alleviate symptoms and minimize intoxication, like those available through cannabidiol. And these patients also need clinical supports, like those they'd receive with any other medication therapy. While the Canadian government has signaled its intent to maintain two distinct streams, until now it has focused almost entirely on regulating the recreational market without much consideration for cannabis patients. The proposed regulatory approach essentially maintains the current status quo for medical cannabis under the Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes Regulations, or ACMPR. This will make recreational cannabis easier to access than medical cannabis, and risk pushing patients into the recreational stream. Currently, when patients receive a medical document for cannabis, access is strictly available through mail-order licensed distributors or by personal cultivation. There will be little incentive for patients to continue to access cannabis this way once recreational cannabis is widely available in retail stores, especially since the government has indicated that it wants to impose a similar taxation framework for both streams. If easier access pushes patients to the recreational cannabis stream, they lose risking all medical oversight and increase their chances of complications. We need to ensure that medical cannabis patients are supported and protected through a distinct medical stream and incentivized to continue to use this stream once recreational cannabis is legal.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for listening to the voice of pharmacists from Canada and from Quebec, where medical cannabis is a subject that is a subject of consent in our industry. In our order, we agree that medical cannabis must be distributed under the supervision of a health professional. This position is also consented by Quebec politics. Even Minister Lucie Charlebois supports our measures. Medical cannabis in pharmacies is a measure that is also welcomed by patients. A February 2016 poll states that 52% of Canadians want medical cannabis to be distributed through pharmacies. In Quebec, a similar poll from last December states that 75% of Quebecers want medical cannabis to be clearly framed by a credible structure. Only 4% of Quebecers believe that medical cannabis should go through mail order as it is now. Given the effects and possible interactions of medical cannabis with other medication, it is clear that only a pharmacist has the necessary tools to ensure a professional supervision of the matter. We have to end mail order distribution. We believe that medical cannabis, because it is prescribed by a medical expert, must be considered at the same level as any other prescription medication. Therefore, it needs to be dispensed by a pharmacist that will ensure a medical continuation of treatment. Having access to the full medical case file for a patient, a pharmacist can ensure a follow-up with the patient, but can also give better advice. Let us remember that cannabis, like other prescription medication, has different characteristics that only pharmacists can understand fully. For example, veterans that suffer from PTSD or patients that have mental health issues, for which medical cannabis is a third or fourth line of treatment, all these people often take other medications. There's a real danger in counterindications and other interactions between different medications, and pharmacists know how to deal with these situations. One must remember that pharmacies are strictly framed throughout the supply chain, and it has been completely digitalized, which allows us to guarantee security and traceability, which is not the case with the current mail order system. Oversight systems for opiates is the best tool to protect the confidential data of patients and to allow a clinical oversight of the prescription of a number of different medications.
Thank you again for the opportunity to represent Canadian pharmacists today. Pharmacists are committed to ensuring that our patients have access to appropriate medication therapy and that their therapy is safe and effective. As we move forward with the legalization of recreational cannabis, we are asking the government to ensure that there is clear differentiation between the recreational and medical cannabis streams and incentives for patients to remain in the medical cannabis system. We further believe that pharmacists are untapped resources who should be used to strengthen the medical cannabis stream through appropriate dispensing and clinical oversight, as we do for all other medications. Thank you, and I would be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Next will be the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries, Jeremy Jacob.
Thank you, Senators, for the opportunity to address this room. My name is Jeremy Jacob, and I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries. For full disclosure, I'm also a mechanical engineer with 15 years working in the renewable energy sector. I'm the father of 4 adult daughters, and I'm also co-founder of Village Bloomery, a medical cannabis shop in Vancouver, BC. CAMCD was formed in 2011 to provide patients with safe, affordable, and consistent access to cannabis and to transition the businesses that serve them into the regulated market. CAMCD represents morality, ethics, and compassion. CAMCD participated in the creation of Vancouver's medical marijuana bylaw program. We were invited to sit with the federal task force. We've been engaged at multiple levels of government throughout this process and have submitted numerous papers to government. CAMCD is self-regulated by publishing the only dispensary operating guidelines in Canada. And with this as our guide, CAMCD dispensaries have enacted the highest standards for cannabis retail in Canada. We applaud the federal government for its pursuit of recreational cannabis legalization and for its inclusion of storefront retail on the program. However, the absence of regulations for medical cannabis storefronts remains an unfortunate omission from Bill C45. We have 4 key requests to ask of Senate. One is to create an excise tax exemption for medical patients and allow this exemption to be exercised at storefront dispensaries or retail storefronts. To improve patient access through providing for medical storefronts and through product diversity. To encourage the transition of as many existing industry participants as possible into the regulated market, and to ensure that amnesty and expungements are part of cannabis legalization. Here's why. The first point we make is that there is an access gap that's been created due to the lack of regulated medical storefront access in the MMAR, MMPR, and ACMPR programs. Canadians living in areas where they have access to community dispensaries have overwhelmingly chosen this avenue as their choice to access medical cannabis. The face-to-face interaction, the product diversity, and the real-time availability of helpful information and access to products are key reasons storefronts were able to close this access gap. These are essential elements in helping consumers understand the use of cannabis products and to gain the best wellness outcomes. In the regulated system, with no excise tax relief and no cost coverage through the federal medical program, many Canadians will seek to continue gaining access for medical reasons through regulated recreational storefronts. Our recommendation to address this access gap would be to provide patients with an excise tax exemption and allow them to use it at regulated retail storefronts. In addition, an education program is needed for practitioners to increase their knowledge base and to feel more empowered to grant access to patients. Now, to ensure a successful regulated program, the regulated program has to emulate the unregulated. The industry in BC was allowed to evolve over time based on listening to the needs of people. It's imperative that consumers can find the complete range of products currently available in the unregulated market within the regulated marketplace, or they'll return to these unregulated market sources. Regarding high-potency flowers, extracts, and other products, we strongly recommend against restrictions on these. We need to trust Canadians to make responsible decisions for themselves, as they do with every other product available to them. High-potency products are critical for those dealing with chronic pain, cancer, and especially relevant when countering opiate use. Ingested doses of 50 to 100 milligrams are quite commonplace for patients who are transitioning from opiates to non-toxic, non-lethal cannabis. Lack of availability of higher potency products runs the risk of leaving patients without the effective tools that are serving them now and would exacerbate the opioid crisis rather than providing viable harm reduction options. 5 years to review the medical cannabis program is too long for patients to wait, and we ask Senate to amend C45 so that the medical program is reviewed in full in not more than a year. We ask you to please ensure that patients have storefront access, product diversity, and broadened education for practitioners. Now, on the transition point, BC has a mature and robust cannabis industry that is a key economic driver in the province. Regional economies across BC depend on cannabis for their economic stability. This industry is larger than forestry, fishing, and mining combined in BC. It's the single biggest cash crop in the province, and the majority of participants in this industry are otherwise law-abiding citizens. This is according to a Justice Canada report that I know has been brought to the attention of the Senate and by other speakers. Many of these industry participants are eagerly awaiting a transition opportunity and a chance to be regulated. So we understand from Health Canada that product diversity is in plan, and there are small producer micro-license categories being produced. We ask the Senate to take steps to make sure that this transition is as inclusive as possible, undermining the unregulated market through inclusion is a far nobler way to end prohibition than to prolong and extend the failed war on cannabis. This is consistent also with what we've seen in successful U.S. states in transitioning existing industry participants. And finally, amnesty. The war on drugs has disproportionately criminalized the poor, Canada's First Nations, and Canadians of color. This needs to end, and the start would be amnesty for nonviolent criminals, our cannabis prisoners, and an expungement of their records. Justice Minister Rolf Goodale has suggested that this would be or may be considered after legalization is proclaimed, but we ask the Senate to ensure that amnesty and expungement are part of Bill C45. Amnesty was part of the original Liberal Party resolution on marijuana legalization. So I have many other comments, and I invite all of your questions on these or any other topics, and we thank you for this opportunity to present our views and our perspective on Bill C45.
Thank you very much. And next, Tilray, Philippe Lucas, Vice President, Global Patient Research and Access, it says here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Philippe Lucas. I'm VP Patient Research and Access at Tilray. I'm also a graduate researcher with the Canadian Institute of Substance Use Research. I've been working with medical cannabis patients for over 20 years. I started out as a patient, then a longtime patient advocate, and then a patient provider. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been a medical cannabis researcher focusing on patient patterns of use and the use of cannabis substitute for alcohol, opioids, and other substances. I first had a chance to testify in front of the Senate in 2002 when the Senate Special Committee on Legal Drugs was touring the country, and I have to say that I think Chair Nolan would have been very proud of the work the Senate's done on this issue, and I wish you were here to see the progress that we've made on this file that was so important to him. I've got some document in front of you, and if you want to follow along with some of the data that I'll be sharing with you, I hope to share a bit of enlightening data on patient patterns of use. I want to start out by telling you a little bit about Tilray and Canada's place in the medical program internationally. Tilray is a global pioneer, and we're currently providing cannabis in 10 countries on 5 continents right now. And what a unique opportunity Canada has right now in being a leader in medical cannabis provision for countries around the world, whether it be in the EU, in Germany, in Chile, and in South America, or more recently in Africa. Medical cannabis produced in Canada right now is helping patients all around the world, and it's a really unique opportunity that's been created for Canadian medical cannabis producers. We run a state-of-the-art facility. We were the first GMP-certified facility in Nanaimo, BC, and we recently announced a partnership with Sandoz, which is the first major relationship with a major pharmaceutical company that's happened so far within this medical cannabis industry. And we're pleased to say that we're involved in significant clinical trials to try and shine a light and increase the knowledge on medical cannabis, and have recently finished a clinical trial with Sick Kids Hospital looking at pediatric epilepsy, and the results are quite stunning, and how it's helped kids with severe seizure disorder address pediatric epilepsy. I'm now going to share the results of the Tilray Observational Patient Study, which is the largest national longitudinal tracking of medical cannabis patients to date. This study is taking place right now at 19 medical centers in 5 different provinces. We're tracking the impact of medical cannabis on quality of life and on prescription drug use of right now there's over 1,450 participants in the study. We're still recruiting for this study, but today I'm going to share the preliminary results from 573 of the patients who've completed at least one follow-up study, and this data analysis was done in cooperation with the University of British Columbia, a center called CHIOS. So on the finding page, you'll see that the sample is 55% female with an average age of 49 years old, which may fly in the face of some of the public perception of who's using medical cannabis in Canada. It's really not just 18-year-old men, in a basement hitting a bong, waiting for a doctor to write a prescription to legalize the recreational use. In my 20 years of working with patients, what I typically see are middle-aged individuals who've had treatment failures or unsatisfactory results from traditional pharmaceutical treatments who are looking for alternatives. And in fact, seniors and women are the fastest rising group in the medical cannabis program right now in Canada. The top 3 symptoms reported by patients were chronic pain, insomnia, and anxiety. And in fact, that we see that about 80% of Canadian patients are using cannabis in the treatment of pain and mental health. And those of you with a mental health or with a health background will know that those are often comorbidities. That you often see pain and mental health as comorbidities. Patients with long-term pain conditions develop mental health conditions, and sometimes vice versa as well. The average cannabis use was 8.9 grams per week. And the most common method of use was oral ingestion. So we're no longer seeing patients in Canada typically smoking medical cannabis. We're seeing extracts as being more and more important in the course of care, along with vaporization. Interestingly enough, the preferred type of cannabis in this particular study was high CBD cannabis, which has caused a lot of great enthusiasm amongst the medical community because it's non-impairing and certainly has become more and more important in terms of patient care, although I want to point out that a great number of patients still depend on THC and high THC products for their care. So the high number of women participants, as well as the preference for high CBD extracts, really marks a significant shift in patient patterns of use compared to what we've seen historically. On the next slide, you'll see that the percentage of patients using opioid, non-opioid pain medications, antidepressants, anti-seizure medications, benzodiazepines, sleep meds, and muscle relaxants all declined significantly from baseline to 6 months. So we can't look at medical cannabis in isolation when you're looking at the impact it has on people's lives, on people's health. You have to look at the impact it has on reducing the use of other substances. Here I've shared data on the impact on prescription drugs, but past surveys and studies I've done, as well as others have done, has shown reductions in not only prescription drug use, but on alcohol and tobacco use, and also reductions in the use of illicit substances simply by introducing medical cannabis into patient courses of care. On the next slide, you'll see data specific to opioid use. I don't need to share, I'm sure, with this committee the opioid crisis that we're seeing here in Canada. I honestly think that the data supports the fact that cannabis can play a role in interrupting the opioid overdose crisis, which is having such an impact in my home province of British Columbia, but all over Canada and North America right now. So we see that with this patient population, baseline opioid use was reported by 32% of patients initially, and at 6 months that dropped to 13% of patients in the study. So a significant reduction in the percentage of patients who are using opioids as a result of introducing cannabis in their course of care. The next slide is even more dramatic. It shows that mean opioid use went from 187 milligrams per day and was reduced to 48 milligrams per day at 6 months, a 74% reduction. And in fact, about 50% of the initial opioid users had quit using opioids by 6 months. We're seeing a significant reduction in the dependence on opioids. And I think that medical cannabis clearly adds a tool to the tool belt of physicians and patients who want to deal with chronic pain. Now, on top of that, you also see significant improvements in quality of life, and the greatest changes were in physical health, with a 31% increase from baseline at 6 months, and psychological health, which saw a 17% increase in the quality of life in patients. So you reduce the use and dependence on prescription drugs, and you increase the overall quality of life of patients as well. So I want to say that, the government's stated goals in regards to medical cannabis have been normalization and harm reduction. And I'm concerned that some of the policies in C45 are inconsistent with these important goals. The first point I want to bring up echoes something that my colleague and friend Jeremy has said, which is that taxation issue. Cost is an ongoing obstacle to access for critically and chronically ill Canadians and who are using medical cannabis in their course of care. And over the last 20 years, that's been one of the battles I've been fighting to try and reduce the cost to patients. At Tilray, we reduced the cost by giving discounts to low-income patients. We give a 10% discount to seniors as well. But I'm really concerned about the ongoing taxation of medical cannabis. Medical cannabis should be treated like all other prescription drugs in Canada. It shouldn't be taxed at all, let alone subject to an excise or sin tax. It simply doesn't make sense, and it's not in keeping with the goals of the government to normalize medical cannabis use. And it's also a little bit stunning. I was an elected official for a while, and I don't understand the politics of this. There's no political support for ongoing taxation of medical cannabis. I've never met a politician, an elected official, a senator who says I really strongly support continuing to tax critically and chronically ill Canadians in this way. And there's no opposition to removing the tax. So I'd really urge the Senate, as this House of Sober Second Thought, to take a leadership role in this and make sure that medical cannabis is no longer taxed for those critically and chronically ill Canadians who can benefit from its use. The second part I want to address is about smart, effective branding and the impact that smart, effective branding can have in reducing harms and improving public health. Patients need clarity, and consumers need guidance. They have told us this, and they have told over and over again Senate committees about their need for clarity and guidance when it comes to both the medical and recreational use of cannabis. Medical cannabis ultimately is safer than many prescription drugs that are available out there, and yet the branding restrictions under C45 will mean that medical cannabis is not able to brand the same way as other prescription drugs, even when it ends up in the pharmacy system, which simply doesn't make sense from in that consideration. Medical cannabis branding restrictions should be the same as all other prescription drugs and not subject to the branding restrictions of C45. Additionally, plain packaging clearly leads to increased risk of medication errors. There's a large body of scientific literature to support this, and we've heard stories in the U.S. where patients have meant to use a CBD product and accidentally used a THC product. And while it's not a fatal situation, it does cause a lot of discomfort. So we absolutely need differentiation of lookalike products via color cues and other visual differentiators to improve public health and safety. So the regulation should encourage differentiation rather than homogenization of these different products, particularly if they're going to end up in the pharmacy system, and as we see increasing use by patients throughout Canada. In talking more towards the recreational use, branding allows consumers to differentiate between high and low quality products and safer and more dangerous products. I don't know how many folks on the committee drink craft beer, but I will, yeah, absolutely. In order to dissuade smoking and encourage safe use of cannabis, regulations should consider different branding standards between smoked and non-smoked products. C45 presents a unique, singular opportunity to move cannabis users away from smoked ingestion, and we should not squander this chance to improve public health. And if we allow a broader opportunity to brand and to market products that are non-smoked products, we can actually shift the population away from smoking to non-smoked products. And I think that's an opportunity that we shouldn't squander and we shouldn't miss from a public health point of view. Thank you all very much. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for the opening comments. And before I turn it over to my colleagues with questions, let me throw one question out at the beginning here. You've all said that the excise tax should not be applied in the medical cannabis case. There should be an exemption for it. The Pharmaceutical Association started out by saying that there needs to be incentivizing to continue to use this stream once recreational cannabis is legal. Now, do you think that all of you think that the tax exemption is the only thing that is needed to do that, or are you suggesting that other things are needed to incentivize people to use that stream rather than going to the new commercial kind of stream for recreational use? I'll start with the Pharmaceutical Association.
We've made the position that medical marijuana should be exempted for tax purposes, zero rated as other prescription drugs are. We've not come out with a position as to how to further incentive beyond that. Yeah.
The Quebec case, what you were telling us is most people will want to go to the stores, the shops to do that, or the pharmacies.
But it's not only an economic topic, it's a clinical topic. We're talking about medication here, and we never talk about how patients are taken care of, supervised by a professional. Taxes, cannabis should not be taxed like a prescription drug, but there's more than that. There's the professional requirement needed with the product. So tax is good, but there's a lot more needed to be done.
Yeah, except you don't have that involvement now with the system. So anything from...
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that I can't overstate how important it is to have that patient-physician relationship when it comes to the medical use of cannabis, particularly with a lot more naive users coming into the program, whether it be children, whether it be seniors who may have very little experience with the use of medical cannabis in the past. And I'm very concerned that if there's no differential pricing via taxation or other coverage, that we're just going to get people self-medicating through the recreational system to the great deficit, I think, of those patients and those outcomes. Doctors are getting more and more familiar with the difference between THC and CBD and the appropriate use of one versus the other, and they're also getting more familiar with the use of smoked or inhaled product versus orally ingested products. In my course of work...
I understand what you're saying about the tax exemption. You're all saying the same thing. What I'm saying is that going to be enough?
No, I think that one more... yesterday I had the opportunity to present to a private payer conference, and I did that last week as well. So one of the things that we're working on is getting increased private payer coverage for medical cannabis as well, as a precursor ultimately to provincial coverage for medical cannabis. And that is happening now with Sun Life starting coverage, Green Shield offering coverage, and of course Veterans Affairs Canada offering coverage for patients as well. I think that will incentivize people to stay in that medical system.
Mr. Jacob?
Thank you. These are, that's a great question, and I think that Philippe hit it. We need to see our medical programs covering these costs for especially the critically ill patients. The cost of cannabis medication can be quite expensive, and many of these people who are chronically ill, suffering from seizure disorders, cancer, fibromyalgia can be debilitating. They are not able to work, and they are often not able to afford their cannabis regime, which they have chosen for their health and wellness. So having that included in some way would be a benefit to many Canadians.
That could be a long haul. You have to get them on the formularies, and you've got all sorts of campaigning to do with the private sector plans. Anyway, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and we'll start with Deputy Chair Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all very much for your presentations. They have provided us with an awful lot of important information. And so thank you. I think I'd like to pursue the point that the Chair began with. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Tiffault, about what you refer to as the clinical role as opposed to the economics of it. So it's clear from the poll that you cited, the survey that you cited, that more than half of Canadians want to see medical cannabis distributed through a pharmacy, and that Quebecers are particularly concerned about mail distribution. So I'd really appreciate it if you tell us a little bit more about what the problems are with mail distribution in Quebec, why people are unhappy with that. I mean, clearly the pharmacist's role is, I understand as a Quebecer that the pharmacist's role is patient-centered. And in fact, this committee did a study on the pharmaceuticals in Canada. It was a 3-year study, and we looked at unintended consequences and the problems around polypharmacy, frankly, and the role of overprescribing. And we did talk with pharmacists who really have an information system, collect the data, are very patient-centered, and very often are the only ones who know the number of medications that a patient takes. So if you could give me some information about the Quebec situation and how you see the role of pharmacists here, and specifically if you could tell us a little bit about the importance of the supply chain in the pharmacy and how that would provide a secure supply chain for cannabis, which, by the way, we've heard about here as a very important issue. I know that's a lot, but thank you.
That's all right. If you allow me, I'll go on in French, because just to make sure I'm... on parle beaucoup.
We talk a lot about access to cannabis. We don't talk much about ensuring that the patient receives the right product, that the dosages are well controlled. We just talk about access. It's an economic, a financial issue, access to the product. The present system appears, to my mind, to pose a conflict of interest problem. The producer will sell directly to the patient. We're not accepting the idea that a pharmacy would sell the product to the patient with a prescription. So a neutral intervener overseen by a professional association to ensure that the dosages are appropriate. It might be to some extent complacent. We're talking here about prescriptions, but I think there's a role for pharmacists here. We're talking about access. There are clinics that are funded by cannabis producers in order for patients to obtain prescriptions. And this gives rise to questions in my mind with regard to Quebec. I think people are sensitive to this perception of a conflict of interest. There are costs that are on the rise. They're exploding. Consumption is on the rise. The number of patients is increasing. We saw this with veterans. The budget for their care has exploded. Do all these patients need cannabis? I can't say so, but they all need clinical care with opiates or other products. When they're suffering, when they're in pain. You're talking about the supply chain. Yes, it is something that the pharmaceutical system could allow for. In Quebec, the system that was chosen for the recreational side, well, it's Quebec society that will set up a closed shop, so to speak, a closed circuit. If we allow the exclusive sale of medicinal marijuana in pharmacies in Quebec, those are the only two networks that could sell cannabis online for the recreational stream. So these are two closed streams. In pharmacies, we receive narcotics, methadone, very controlled substances with a controlled chain all the way from the producer to the pharmacy. And it's not a permeable system. With regard to the quality of the supply, I think that we've closed a lot of doors, resolved a lot of issues. We've injected transparency in the system. A professional association will ensure that scientific practices will be respected, that science will move forward, because what we're suggesting in our field of endeavor is that all patients who receive therapeutic cannabis be participants in controlled experimental programs. Pharmacists are properly tooled. We want prescriptions to be well established. And cannabis, as my colleague said, can reduce the consumption of opiates and other drugs. But there must be professional supervision. There can be issues for patients whose medication with antidepressants, for example, is suddenly halted. So we might see a controlled reduction in the consumption of other products thanks to cannabis.
That 5 minutes, each senator has 5 minutes, and that includes the answer. And so short questions and short answers, you can get in more questions and more answers. So the next 5-minute period belongs to Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. To Mr. Tiffault, in your remarks, you mentioned the fact of, I guess, the effort to end mail order distribution. I'm just wondering what you would say to persons or people that in remote parts of the country that don't have access to a pharmacy, that don't have inner communities, and to be able to avail of a medicine that the doctor has prescribed to them. So I just wonder how you would suggest we address
I don't
that.
know the situation elsewhere in Canada, but in Quebec, there's not so many places where you cannot access a pharmacy within 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, and we have deliveries. We have people need regular prescription drugs, so they can get cannabis access through the actual system. So there's a way to bring medications to faraway regions. I'm sure there's a way to bring cannabis also with the regular actual system. And the mail order, we know who's signing the reception of the product, but who's using it? Do we know it's an underage patient? Is it? We don't know who's using the product after once it's sent out. So in pharmacy, we do each time we do check with the patient, and as the condition change and so on.
Mr. Lucas, you want to?
Sure, I just wanted to respond. I want to say that, the industry in general is supportive of pharmacy-based access. We feel that pharmacists play an important frontline role in terms of healthcare provision, and that having cannabis in pharmacies offers an opportunity for pharmacovigilance to be able to track how patients are using medical cannabis, as well as the impact on prescription drugs, the kind of research that I do. I'm a little bit concerned about the suggestion that any patient in Quebec needs to be part of a research project against their will in a lot of cases in order to access medical cannabis. I think that, as a long-term patient advocate, flies in the face of some of the constitutional rights that patients have to access medical cannabis in Canada, but that's the situation we find ourselves right now in Quebec. I also suggest that while I support pharmacy access, I don't think we should be shutting down mail order for the same reasons that Senator Manning just mentioned. I'm concerned that patients who are housebound and who may be living in more remote communities may not be able to access pharmacies quite as easily as suggested. And so I think that anything that increases options to patients, from my point of view, is going to be beneficial, including pharmacy-based access. But I don't think we should make that the exclusive means of access for patients.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm wondering about the concern that's been raised here this morning and has been raised here in the past in relation to the fact of people that either don't have access to or cannot afford medical cannabis will go to the recreational side of things, or to the black market, or whatever the case may be. I just wonder, from a cost perspective, a gram of, I'm not sure of how it's prescribed, but a gram of medical cannabis versus a gram of recreational cannabis, what's the cost from a consumer point of view? How would they? Mr. Jacob? Yep.
Yeah, in the existing market, the variance is wide, anywhere from $5 or $6 to $15, depending on the grade, the quality of the product, the type of cannabis. And I think that should be, again, replicated in the recreational market. The full range of different qualities and types of cannabis is what consumers are looking for. But as it pertains to medical, I think that there are so many various strains and so many unique effects from those strains, and then so many different interactions from individuals. So they're going to be looking, it's a process of elimination to find what works for you. And that applies to both inhaled products and tincture-based products. Each plant has a unique chemical profile of cannabinoids and terpenes. So finding your right fit is a process that can become expensive if there are limits to your purchasing. So, for example, if you're on a mail order system, and you can help me, but I believe that there are minimum orders, and if you're finding that this minimum order is not working for me, you suddenly have an expensive, piece of product that you can't use. So the solution to that is storefront access and the ability to purchase in small quantities, find your way, and find what works, and then settle on your suitable products.
I agree with the statements of Mr. Jacobs, and generally I would suggest, however, that the cost difference between the licit and illicit market in terms of medical cannabis is about the same. So the prices range, as Mr. Jacobs said, from about $5 to $15, and that's the same whether you're buying from a licensed producer or from a dispensary. However, I am worried that the taxation of medical cannabis as it stands right now really discourages patients from being able to access as much as they might need, and forces patients to choose sometimes between putting food in their fridge or paying the rent and getting as much medical cannabis they need to take care of their symptoms. And that's a concern, along with the lack of options that patients have within the current system in terms of accessing edibles, accessing vaporizer cartridges, and vape pens that are increasingly popular in medical cannabis patients in Canada and internationally. So the cost is about the same, but there is a disparity in terms of the products that one can access through the legal system versus the currently unregulated system.
Okay, thank you.
Very much. Now I have Senator Dean.
Thanks for the very, very helpful presentations. It's notable that you all appear to be of one mind on the benefits of medical cannabis, including our pharmacist colleagues. And I'm particularly interested to hear and see evidence of the benefits of cannabis in opioid in relation to opioid issues. We've heard evidence here to the contrary, of course, that that there's a one-way gateway from cannabis to inappropriate use of opioids. This is the second hearing in a row where we've heard evidence on exactly the reverse. I'd appreciate any further comments you have on opioids. We've heard from a couple of you in terms of reduction and treatment. And as a second question to ponder on, two very quick ones, is we've talked about the possible migration of medical users to recreational. Is there any possibility as a result of anything that we're doing here or might do as a result of your recommendations on taxes that might see a reverse migration of recreational users to an already rapidly growing medical market? So those are my two questions.
First question that you posed. I work in an addiction clinic pharmacy here in Ottawa, and we see patients being systematically taken off opioids using medications such as methadone, Suboxone, and soon likely we're going to be adding heroin to that mix. We're dealing with a receptor, a unique receptor when it comes to opiates. That's different to the receptor that cannabis attaches to. So the substitution is not a perfect one, and while we're intrigued by the evidence to suggest that this could be a way of weaning people off opioids, we know that transition is something that's fairly complex, and that's part of the reason that we feel that pharmacists have an intrinsic role to play in this, because as I say, it's not a perfect substitution, and as our patients who are taken off opioids through other means, it requires a very systematic approach of tapering, and how that is done is it's almost an art to make sure that this person doesn't relapse, because we notice in many cases relapse can be even worse in terms of outcomes. So, I mean, again, the evidence is intriguing and it's interesting, but it's not a perfect substitution, and we think more evidence is required to get there. We do feel that there's a potential, with regards to your second question, for patients to move from the recreation to the medical side. Right now there are a limited number of indications for which cannabis has been shown to show evidence, but we know that there's more evidence coming, and I think what we could see is as the evidence grows, we could potentially see that happening. We don't see that necessarily as a bad thing, because we know that 1 out of 9 hospital admissions is due to the adverse effects due to medication, and part of the reason that pharmacists are there is to try and mitigate that. And so if more patients are seeing clinical oversight by pharmacists to ensure that medication, that cannabis, fits with the other medications that they're taking, and it's not going to result in them being admitted to the hospital, that's important to us. So that could actually be, there could be positive outcomes there for sure.
There's certainly a growing amount of evidence that cannabis, rather than being a gateway drug, is an exit drug to addiction. Backhuber and al. In 2014 published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association showing that in U.S. medical cannabis states they had a 25% reduction in opioid overdose deaths compared to those neighboring states that didn't have medical cannabis programs in place. And the longer the program was in place in those states, the greater the effect size. So I think that this is very convincing, and recent data out of Colorado suggests the exact same thing. By legalizing the recreational and medical use of cannabis, they've seen a significant decline in opioid overdose deaths and mortalities. We've just started a study called the Substitution of Opioids Study here in Ottawa, at Recovery Ottawa, the biggest methadone Suboxone clinic here in Ottawa, where we're looking at the impact of medical cannabis on treatment adherence for Suboxone methadone. We think that preliminary data suggests that patients who are looking to get off opioids are very vulnerable when they start methadone Suboxone treatment, and if they fail out, they're at the biggest risk of overdose at that point. So if cannabis can help keep those patients on those treatments by reducing some of the withdrawal and some of the cravings associated with that, we think that could actually save lives. So we're looking forward to sharing that data with you once that comes on board. I do want to say that, and I agree with, however, the Pharmacists Association, that this substitution for opioids needs to be done in a very deliberate and systematic manner, and it's in many ways right now it's being done in an ad hoc manner. And we can improve public health by making this a public health strategy. Right now, medical cannabis is a third line of treatment for chronic pain, and opioids is the second line of treatment. So if we follow those treatment guidelines, you have to fail out of opioid treatment before you'd consider cannabis treatment. And we need to modernize those guidelines to make cannabis on par, at least as a second-line treatment option. In regards to the transferring of patients from recreational and medical, we have a high standard right now, and it's a high bar for patients to get in our medical cannabis program. We have 300,000 Canadians currently registered in our federal program, but according to surveys, about 1 million Canadians claim to be using cannabis for medical purposes. So 2/3 of those patients are not part of our program right now. I don't think we're going to see a mass migration just for a minor cost savings into the medical program from the recreational when it's going to be so much easier to access recreational cannabis ultimately in Canada.
Thank you.
Is there no
Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here. I have so many questions that I think I'm just going to try to give bullet questions to see if I can get bullet answers and get as many as I can get in. Following Senator Manning's questions, why such a difference in cost of the recreational marijuana and medical marijuana?
As Philippe was saying, the costs do line up, but why such a difference from top to low end? Is that more to the point? Production style, larger scale production, economies of scale, lower costs. Smaller, crafty, small batch production, more intensive, more hands-on treatment of plants, higher costs.
Okay. So somebody that's buying medical marijuana compared to recreational marijuana, they're getting two different products, are they?
Because both types of products exist in both worlds. It's really the same products for both worlds.
So if they can get it so much cheaper at the recreational side, why would they go to the medical place to get it, other than wanting the confidentiality and the help being monitored by a doctor and by pharmacists that know how to guide them, I guess, through their medical process of needing the marijuana? Would that be the only advantage?
Go to the medical program?
Yes.
Well, I think that, this allows me to speak to your question as well. A lot of consumers who come to cannabis through the recreational avenues that we have today are coming for medical reasons because of the difficulty to access.
Right.
So we had an example of a person who came in with a shoulder injury, didn't want to get onto the opiates that were prescribed, began taking a cannabis tincture that was a ratio between THC and CBD, and realized that she was no longer taking her OCD medication. Her kids would always remind her when it was out, because she started to be OCD. Okay. So she was on cannabis medication for pain and realized that my mental health issues are resolving themselves. So this is a patient now who potentially would realize that these benefits exist for them and will seek access to their physician to the medical program.
Right.
Sure. Just for clarity, maybe Jeremy and I weren't clear. The range in cost for a gram of cannabis within the medical and the recreational system is about the same. It's $5 to about $15 a gram, but that's not a difference between medical and recreational. The $5 gram in the medical system would be the same cost in the recreational system. It's just that's typically the range in prices, and that could be reflective of THC levels in a lot of cases, where higher THC products can fetch a higher value, whether it be for medical or recreational use, and more and more CBD products are a little bit more expensive because those plants, you need more plants to produce a CBD extract than you do a higher THC extract. So that can be more cost prohibitive to Canadians. But just to be clear, there is no financial difference between the recreational cannabis and medical. We wouldn't expect there to be some, but we do hope that the taxation's removed on the medical, so it's zero rated.
Right. I want to really share that from what I'm hearing up in my end of the province, that the people that need medical marijuana would prefer, because of confidentiality, to be able to go into a drugstore and get it rather than going to a front store or have somebody deliver it by mail. I'm hearing that that's what the people would like to see it. And I understand also that, Mr. Lucas, that you have recently, there's a recent deal with your company signing up with Shoppers Drug Mart, from my understanding, to supply their brand medical cannabis, which is conditional to being approval of the pharmacy distribution, able to distribute the medical marijuana. Can you tell me a little bit what is the key factor holding the pharmaceutical distribution of the medical marijuana at this point? And if you do have it, will you be able, through a pharmacy, offer it at the same cost that a person would be getting it through another system that they're getting it now?
What a terrific set of questions, and thank you for the question. Right now, the biggest obstacle is that there's no explicit provision in C45 or in the current regulations to allow pharmacy-based access. we are extremely concerned by the suggestions of the government that they're going to look at that as a next stage of changes in these regulations, maybe going as far out as 2020. As we know, Health Canada, when they initiated the MMPR in 4 or 5 years ago, initially anticipated pharmacy-based distribution. The pharmacy system at the time wasn't comfortable with that and the level of consultation they'd had, and they asked to be excluded from that option. But obviously there's been a big turnaround, and now pharmacists feel that they want to be able to do this. And of course they're well positioned to catch contraindications in interactions with other medications. Shoppers Drug Mart is taking a unique path. They're asking to be a licensed producer on par with Tilray or the other 100 licensed producers in Canada, so that they can purchase from other licensed producers and distribute through their system. What Shoppers Drug Mart will be able to do in the next few months is not going to be what other pharmacies are going to be able to do, because they're kind of going around the current regulations by making themselves a licensed producer. We think it's great that cannabis will be available through Shoppers Drug Mart, but we would like to see all pharmacies in Canada being able to supply medical cannabis to patients, because we think, I've been working on this for 20 years, nothing is going to do more to help in the normalization of medical cannabis than having it available through pharmacies. No matter what we do to educate patients, we have a 24/7 helpline, etc., it still feels different than every other medication when patients have it delivered to their door.
Why can't other pharmacies do the same thing as Shoppers? Oh, sorry.
They could do the same as well, but it's a time-consuming process to become a licensed producer.
Thank you, Chair.
Oh, you got it in 5 questions. That's pretty good. Sénatrice Meiji, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais vous poser la question.
Thank you very much. I'll be asking my questions in French. My question is for the two pharmacists, Mr. Emberley and Mr. Tiffault. I saw in your documentation that you bring up the issue of dispensaries as sales outlets that are multiplying. We've seen the number of them increase over the last months. Is the term dispensary a specialized and recognized term? And in the Act, we can't deal with what's at the heart of the legislation, but in the recommendations or the amendments, is there room, would there be room for inserting this term? Because if the market continues to grow in this way, there will be dispensaries, but we all know that there will be outlets, sales outlets, not places where patients will be able to get advice. How might we as legislators do something to prevent this?
We've seen the proliferation of dispensaries over the last few years, and it is something that deeply concerns us. The term dispensary is interesting. There are protected terms within the pharmacy profession. The word pharmacy, the word apothecary, these are protected terms that no other retail outlet is to use. And I actually did some research, and while dispensary is not a protected term under most of the acts across the country, it has a very specific term within our profession. It is the professional area within a pharmacy where prescriptions are filled, and that department is led by a licensed pharmacist who is held to very high standards of practice and is bound by an ethical framework that is very specific to the role of the pharmacist. So the word dispensary is something that's very near and dear to us, and in our mind, using it outside of the terms of pharmacy provides a legitimacy to those who are running quote-unquote dispensaries that may give Canadians the wrong impression about what is actually going on and what that level of knowledge that person has. It may give the impression that person is a licensed healthcare professional when in fact they're not. So we're deeply concerned about that. We think that within the Act it is something that potentially we should look at as being a protected term because it has a very specific meaning within the pharmacy profession itself, and it does denote a certain clinical expertise that a person may have in talking about cannabis in regards to other medication, because that's what pharmacists do, is they talk about the role of therapy of one medication in light of other medications, many that a person may be taking.
What I would like to add, if you'll allow me, is, and I agree with my colleague with regard to the use of the term dispensary, but there should be minimal training for employees in dispensaries or sales outlets. if we're suggesting a product for insomnia, the first question is, do you take any medication? If the answer is yes, go and get an official opinion, a medical opinion from a pharmacist to ensure that the product is right for you. That should be the minimum. We should be able to raise a red flag if there's a problem and say, no, it won't suit you. The patient must know what level of service will be available. Do I have any time for another question? Yes. A question for Mr. Lucas. I understood that you didn't quite agree with plain packaging. Did I understand correctly? Yes, you did, indeed. So plain packaging shouldn't be a problem if we ensure that the quantity, the number of grams, and the percentage of THC is on the label so that the person who purchases this product knows what he or she is buying. If that information is on the label, would that be sufficient? Unfortunately, research suggests that it isn't enough, that drugs that have names that resemble each other, and we talk about THC, CBD, cannabidiols, well, those are the terms. THC and CBD are letters, 3 letters that most people aren't very familiar with. So there's a concern. What we find is that there are patients who use high-level CBD products during the day and high THC products at night to sleep better, etc. They want to be alert during the day and sleep at night. But it can be dangerous to mix these products up if the person is going to be working, driving a vehicle, and if he or she accidentally takes high THC content products. So we use different colors to differentiate between the grades to ensure that this type of slip-up or mix doesn't occur. But we won't be able to make those distinctions on packaging, and this could be risky for patients. And my concern is that we've been doing this at Tilray and elsewhere in Canada for 5 years. We're not the only company doing this, and we haven't had an issue. So why are we going to change this now for medical cannabis? For the recreational market, it's different. But the 545 rules wouldn't allow us to do what we want to do, and the medical marijuana market is working the way it should. Well, patients will use the product as they wish. If we regulate the product for one market, well, automatically the product sold in the other market will evolve. Well, the products are very different. What I mean with regard to both streams is that I don't think we'll see high-content CBD in the recreational stream. People want to be high. That's why they buy the product. So the THC products will be dominant in the recreational market, but in the medical market, we'll see higher levels CBD products. And this could be confusing for patients. I make presentations to the public all the time, and people don't really understand the distinction between the two products.
We move on. The packaging arrangement now is a different regime from what is being proposed in C45. And what you're saying is you'd like the current packaging regime to be maintained for medical cannabis.
That's absolutely all we're saying. We're saying that we feel that the current system has not caused any problems. There's no reported problems with the current system. We're not allowed heavy branding, but we are allowed product differentiation using color, metric agents and otherwise that aren't going to be allowed under C45. We just feel that as medical cannabis becomes more and more like every other traditional pharmaceutical drug, we should be held to those standards, which we completely agree with, but not the same concerns and public health concerns that are addressed in C45.
Okay. Senator Almadbar.
And thank you all of you for being here. I'll try and get in 3 questions quickly with 3 quick answers. I think I heard from Mr. Lucas some of the background to the question, but I want a response from the pharmacists around the policy rationale when the medical marijuana regime was brought into law. What was the policy rationale then for bypassing pharmacists, and why have the pharmacists, if Mr. Lucas is correct, that they didn't want to do it then, but they're ready now? How have you come on this journey?
Thank you for the question. We do get asked that question. Years ago, we did come out with a statement, as you say, but the landscape has really changed. There are more Canadians that are desiring access to this medication than ever before, and I think as a profession, we need to acknowledge that. And we feel that if that access is going to be enhanced, and there's more evidence to support the use of cannabis for legitimate health conditions, then pharmacists have to be involved because of the unique knowledge and expertise that they have to offer. So that's why we came out with this statement, and it applies. Our position has really been solely focused on the medical cannabis side, and we believe that it is a medication. It should be treated as a medication, and as such, it should be have the clinical oversight of pharmacists.
And also, if you allow, technically, cannabis doesn't have a DIN, a drug identification number. So for a technical reason, we're not allowed to sell the product in pharmacy. So maybe if that had been taken care of earlier, we would have got into the situation earlier. And there's also like the population. We evolved. We heard. We learned about cannabis. We learned how many people were using, the damage of cannabis, and naturally the role of pharmacists in cannabis distribution came. It's very natural for pharmacists now. There's a strong consensus, which wasn't there 2 years ago.
Next question is for Mr. Lucas. We've heard very conflicting witness testimony here around the science of cannabis. That's in this particular question about cannabis as a gateway drug. That the medical head of CAMH, Dr. Lafall, suggested to us that there is no direct evidence concerning cannabis as a gateway. We've also heard from witness testimony about a report from Smart Approaches to Marijuana. I believe this comes from the U.S., where marijuana use, they say doubles opioid use.
You know, I'm currently the author of a systematic review looking at cannabis substitute for alcohol and opioids, and I can tell you that the literature is certainly in favor of supporting the data I shared with you today, that cannabis can play an active role in being a substitute, not just for opioids, but also for alcohol and other drugs. More importantly, I think that the U.S. experience gives us a crystal ball to look into as to what we might expect in terms of the public health impacts of C45 in Canada. In Colorado, they have seen a reductions in alcohol-related automobile fatalities tied to their legalization of cannabis by shifting a small percentage of the population on any given day to using cannabis instead of using alcohol. They've also seen reductions in other alcohol-related impacts, such as reductions in homicides, in suicides, and in violent crimes. And in fact, in Colorado, it's one of the only jurisdictions in all of the U.S. that's actually seen a decline in alcohol use overall, and they're actually making more money on taxation of cannabis than they are on alcohol now, and that's the home of Core, so quite significant in terms of the public health positive impacts that they've seen as a result of this. I think that the evidence is really uncontroversial that I'm sharing with you, and it's also significant to note that in Colorado, after legalization, they're now seeing a reduced use of cannabis by youth, and in fact, they're seeing rates of use as low, they haven't seen rates of use as low since 1982, the same year that Nancy Reagan basically told us to say no to drug use. So the population level evidence and the evidence that I shared with you guys today is supportive of the fact that when adults are given an option between cannabis and alcohol, some will choose alcohol, or some will choose cannabis, and ultimately that leads to positive public health outcomes. That's what I think we can expect here in Canada.
Thank you. I have a smidgen of time for my last question. Any one of you, and I think it can be only one, what is your position on homegrown, the provisions in the bill for 4 plants per individual?
I could speak to that briefly. Yeah. I think that home grow should be a right of Canadians. It's a plant, it's a non-toxic plant that has been in our toolbox as human beings for 7,000 years of recorded history. So this 95-year blip of prohibition shouldn't result in these freedoms not being restored to Canadians. I know that there are many people who would like to not simply grow cannabis, but there are complementary herbs that are anti-inflammatory, and there's a resurgence in plant medicine, and cannabis is a key part of that.
I see Mr. Tiffault
There might be a different view over there, but we've run out of time. Yes, yes, we'll put you down for the second round. Senator McCallum.
Thank you for your presentations. My comment and question will be going to the pharmacists. I had not really looked at the word medical marijuana, and it didn't hit me that if it is used for medical purposes, that there should be an oversight body for this. As a dentist, I've always worked with the pharmacists that I work with, and I'll call him and ask him for advice, or if sometimes patients don't tell you all the meds they're taking, and when I give a prescription, they'll call me and say, did you know this person is also on these meds? And then we change what I'm prescribing. And so I'm a bit concerned about if they're going to use medical marijuana, the term, then there needs to be standards, there needs to be an oversight, because there's also risks and I think malpractice that could come up. And when you're looking at getting the drug and then you have the medical doctor that's prescribed it, you know, they go to the pharmacy to pick up the drug, and it's usually the pharmacist that tells the patient the drug that they're going to take or any interactions. It's usually not the medical doctor or the dentist. And I was concerned when you have patients that are going to find their own fit and that there's no professional involved. Could you talk a little bit more about that, about how that could be corrected, or how?
Thank you for your question, Senator. I think it's a really important one. You know, when you prescribe, say, an opioid for tooth extraction, I think it's really important that you would know that that patient also happens to be taking medical marijuana or medical cannabis. And I think that one thing that pharmacists maintain is a record of all of the medications that a person is taking. And if we fragment healthcare so that we don't capture all that information, there is a potential for people to experience drug interactions. And I think that could be a good example where a physician or a dentist could prescribe an opioid not knowing that the patient is using medical cannabis, and that could result in them having a car accident or we don't know what. And so I think we need to make sure that we create a system that is fairly fail-safe, that protects Canadians from those unintended consequences that could really harm them. I think that we are strengthening our medical records. We're strengthening, hopefully we're going to get to a nationwide e-prescribing so that we'll be able to have that information at our fingertips. But if we fragment, if we don't have access to where the medications that people are using, that will slip through the cracks, and people will still end up with unfortunate circumstances as a result.
Thank you.
Senator Deacon.
Thank you very much. Great speakers, lots of information. We're going as fast as we can to get as much information as we can. And one of the areas that, listening to a variety of perspectives and experts, we're looking at the recommendation of possibly having that sort of single regime for medical and non-medical marijuana. And we've also learned as recent as yesterday here and at the National Finance Committee meeting just how regulated and how enforced and how restricted medical marijuana is, and it's certainly a very, in many aspects, a very positive and admirable way. We're wondering how would bringing cannabis regulations under a single regime, a single umbrella, would impact the work that has been done and the work that needs to be done as we move forward. And I know it's been a bit of a controversial topic, but I'm interested in hearing your perspectives today, and I would welcome anybody to respond to that first.
Just to clarify,
yes.
Are you talking about the suggestion by the CMA and others to make to basically eliminate medical cannabis once we have recreational cannabis available, that basically that would replace the medical cannabis program?
It was more of a, my understanding is not necessarily eliminating, but working together and having under one umbrella with the language of this being better for Health Canada.
Well, I think that if you're talking about having a retail system where, like as in the U.S. states, you'll have certain retailers that can apply for a medical endorsement, where they'll now ensure that they have staff on site who can provide appropriate information and support for people who come in with medical challenges. This is appropriate, I think, for patient access. Being, like Philippe was saying, the more access points we have for cannabis for patients, the more this will become normalized, the more that we will have, the stigmas that are, perhaps wrongfully existing in our society being ameliorated. So I think that, while there needs to be distinct provisions made for medical, having common supply chain and common access points is a very good strategy.
How would it help the work that you're doing now? I guess that's what I'm really trying to figure out. How do we learn from the work that's being done, and how does it help enhance the work that's being done right now in medical marijuana?
I think that as there are more companies like Tilray who are undergoing clinical studies, there will be more opportunities with storefront access for that word to get out, to get more participants on board, and to further the knowledge base of how cannabis benefits Canadians.
Yeah, I think that the challenges with the current program is that there's no community-based access. And obviously pharmacies would offer that, but that doesn't negate the fact that maybe other specialized clinics might be able to offer community-based access. We actually have a two-tiered system already in place when it comes to methadone access in Canada. So you can access methadone through pharmacies or through methadone clinics that are offering community-based and are staffed by folks who specialize in the population that they're working with, people with opioid dependence and otherwise. So a similar system for medical cannabis could be effective as well. But I do think that ultimately the idea of community-based access for patients to be able to access and talk to someone with a healthcare background, to be able to identify interactions, drug interactions, and contraindications is incredibly important. And I really worry about any suggestion that patients can just get access to the cannabis they need through the recreational system. I think the goals of those recreational outlets, whether it be through LCBO in Ontario or otherwise, are going to be, potentially public health centered, and I honestly believe that, but they're not medicinal therapeutic, and I think that that's a really significant differentiation.
Okay, thank you.
I hear, I'll go in French if you don't mind. J'entends beaucoup améliorer l'accès.
I've heard a lot about improving access, but never do we talk about supervision, about following up with the patient, making sure that as with any treatment, we want the right product at the right dosage for the right indication so that we have quick and safe effects for the patient at reasonable cost. And very seldom do we speak of this. We always talk about access, but an access without a framework is a slippery slope. If there are no clarifications from here on in on what should be medical and what should be recreational, all that will be created is more confusion. We'll only be figuring out if this is financially viable rather than medically safe, and clinical research will be able to show us how safe this will be or not. It would be an error to make the medical side more banal. We need to strengthen the medical side of this to make sure that there is a continued optimal therapeutic follow-up.
Sorry. That brings us to the end of round one. I can put you down, Senator, for round two. I've got Senator Seidman and Senator Ahmedvar so far, although we've only got 10 minutes. So, Senator Seidman.
Thank you.
Two. Do you want to go down, Senator Deacon? No.
Yes.
No. Do you want to go down the list? I'll put you down. I'm not calling you yet.
All right.
Okay, I think we'll
right.
need to keep it a little tighter
Right.
then if we got three people. So Senator Seidman.
Okay, thanks. And I have actually two very to-the-point questions, so I hope to get to-the-point answers. One has to do just with continuing this line of discussion about maintaining two different streams, medical marijuana recreational marijuana. And I want to be clear on the answer to that because it has become a question. It has become an issue. There's a lot of complaints about, waiting more than a year, as expressed by Mr. Lucas, to reevaluate the system, medical marijuana system. So I want to know clearly, do you think there should be a medical marijuana system maintained as a separate system from the recreational system? So
I strongly support that, yes.
Yeah.
Supported that.
Okay, perfect. I just want to be clear for the record on that.
Yeah, I believe that while there should be special provisions for medical patients, common access points, as we see in other jurisdictions, is going to be a benefit for those patients.
Okay.
Community access.
Okay, thanks. That's access. That's different, as Mr. Tiffault referred to from. Okay, great. Understood. The other question has to do with the Health Canada drug identification number, and it was referred to in discussion here. And I would just like to hear something about what is actually happening around that, because there was a plan with Health Canada to secure a DIN number for medical cannabis. So could someone please tell me about that?
Sure, I'm happy to tackle that, and I'll be as brief as possible. Health Canada has announced what they've called an accelerated program to create DINs for cannabis. I want to be clear that there'll likely never be a blanket DIN for cannabis, which is thousands of different plants with different cannabinoid ratios. But we're eager to find out more about that. We still haven't. I've got a meeting with Health Canada as part of our industry association meeting on Monday and hope to hear more about that. What I can tell you is that there is a pathway to a DIN, which is through the traditional clinical trial system. Tilray is engaged in 4 phase 2 trials right now, and once they get to phase 3, which is expensive and time consuming, theoretically a DIN could be issued for specific preparations for specific indications. So it's daunting for many companies to take this on, and it's not addressing the patient need right now. The last thing I just want to say on that matter is that DIN should not be a reason for cannabis to not make its way into pharmacies. Pharmacists regularly dispense products that don't have a DIN. Compounding pharmacies create DINs as they compound products as well. And at Tilray, we've actually created pseudo-DINs to help pharmacies and insurance providers track what specific products their patients are using as well. So we're doing our best to try and address the DIN issue.
Great. And would the pharmacist have something to say about that as well?
A DIN would allow the product to be put into the provincial file or the patient file, so any practitioner would see that the patient is receiving cannabis. So security-wise, it would be better.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, thanks.
Companies have a policy of only covering medications with DINs, so that's another point I think that's important to raise.
Yeah, for the insurance coverage. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Ahmedbar.
My question is to Mr. Tiffault. What's your point of view on the 4 plants for private homegrown use?
Well, my concern is that if we allow that for medicinal reasons, we don't know what the person is growing. How can we treat disease with a plant that we don't know how much THC, how much CBD? So that's the first, the clinical part. But the other part is that what is allowed, 4 plants per person is more than the individual need as cannabis. So what happens with the rest of the plant that is produced? Would it be sold to France? So there's an alternate market from homegrown, which is not used by the patient. So that's the second concern we do have. So we support the Quebec's position on that, so to forbid homegrown.
To clarify here, isn't it? It's 4 per household.
Per household, yes, sorry, per
45.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to medical use, this has been established through the Constitution. Patients have a right to produce their own, so I don't see us relitigating that issue. So for medical use, patients have an application process through Health Canada they can go through. It's certainly more strict than what we anticipate to see under the recreational system, and I don't see Health Canada successfully removing that right through the courts as it stands. When it comes to recreational use, I think that, I produce my own tomatoes, and I'm an avid organic gardener, and if recreational users want to produce their own cannabis, I'm convinced they can do so safely and without increasing the risk to communities, to their neighbors or otherwise. So I don't have any real concern in regards to that. Most people simply will not choose to do so. All Canadian patients have a right to do so. Very few choose to do so. When it comes to recreational use, all Canadians can produce their own beer and wine. Most choose not to do so, so I don't anticipate it's going to be a major issue.
Just quickly on that, we don't have a position on it, but we are concerned about children. And if homegrown increases the chances that a child may accidentally ingest this, it is a concern of ours, and we have expressed that.
But you have to smoke it to.
Yeah.
You have to put it. You have
Yes.
to. I mean, it has no effect if you just eat it. So I wonder if that concern is a little overblown.
Yeah. I have difficulty getting my 9-year-old to eat vegetables, so I certainly she would not be tempted to eat any of the household plants or plants around the house. She does nibble around at our garden because she knows the difference between what you can eat and what you can't eat, what's edible and what's not. So I don't share those same concerns. We all, I don't want to ask a show of hands. We all have liquor cabinets at home. There's no safety provisions on a bottle of vodka. I'm far more concerned about my 9-year-old as she grows older getting access to that than plants I might be growing in the backyard.
And the bottle of vodka does not have plain labels.
Exactly.
Senator Deacon.
Distracted. Thank you. A question for you, Mr. Lucas. You talked earlier and in your report, with great thanks, about this society, a compassionate society on Vancouver Island with 2,000 or 3,000 members, and that it's been around for a long time. I'm trying to understand, first of all, that and what that makeup of that group is, generally speaking, in a profile. If you could generalize, and if there are others that you know of across the country of that kind of size, and then as we look at legalizing cannabis, how would they be impacted?
In my 20 years of working with patients, I've had a lot of different viewpoints from that point of view. In 1999, I opened up the Vancouver Island Compassion Society, one of Canada's first nonprofit medical cannabis dispensaries, and I think it's going to be celebrating its 19th anniversary this year. It's been a number of years. I was executive director there for 10 years, and I'm no longer involved in any of the day-to-day operations of the Vancouver Island Compassion Society, and I would suggest that, like licensed producers, like liquor stores, like 7-Elevens, there are some dispensaries out there who are very well-intentioned, very professional, and do a very good job of taking care of their clients, their patients, and otherwise. There are others who are more profits centered and focused on other aspects of this. I think that ultimately a lot of these dispensaries right now are looking to make their way into the legal system, and if allowed to do so, if the hurdles aren't too high, certainly in places like BC where we have a combination of private and public, I expect a number of them to be leaders in the distribution of recreational cannabis going into the future. I would like to defer to Mr. Jacob, who's head of the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries, who might be able to talk about that too.
I understand. Yes, thank you.
One of the biggest concerns faced by many operators of compassion clubs or nonprofit retail shops is, what do we do with our patients? They choose to access cannabis at dispensaries. They've found solutions that are serving them well. We're going to be losing significant amounts of our product diversity at the onset of regulation, and we have no idea how we're going to support these patients through this transition. It's onerous for them. It's causing tremendous amounts of stress. People who are ill do not need that type of stress. And something important to realize for this Senate is that in BC, where we've had 20 years of evolution of a storefront retail model, this is a successful experiment. This is a normalized economy or a normalized environment for cannabis. People can walk past a shop with a mother with her stroller, and it's not onerous. It's not the same as what's been experienced here in Eastern Canada. And I think that this is probably the biggest change, the biggest impact is, how do we support and protect the rights of these patients to access this medicine that's working for them when the product diversity is going to be scaled right back and released over time.
And if
Okay. Very quickly.
Quick point, the removal of product diversity only benefits the black market. And so if patients can't access vape cartridges or the edibles that they've gotten used to, or high potency cannabis, the only winners in that are the black market who are going to continue to supply these products. So the decisions being made here and by Health Canada aren't what Canadian patients or recreational users are going to use. The decisions being made here are deciding what's going to be regulated by the government and what's going to be controlled by the black market. These are the decisions that are being made at this table.
Okay, we've run out of time, sorry to say, but we do have another panel that's in waiting. By the way, the BC Compassion Club Society is in the next panel, so there may be more questions to them on that subject. Anyway, thank you to all four of you. You've been quite helpful to us, and you've explained your positions very well, and we will take all of that into consideration. And with that, I will pause the meeting for about 2 minutes while we change the personnel at the panel table.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
On C45, as before, dealing with cannabis and also amending the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts, and we're focusing on medical cannabis on both our panels today. And on this panel, I welcome James O'Hara, who is the Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana, Hilary Black, who is founder of the BC Compassion Club Society. And here is an individual whose name we've heard of before because we have one of his colleagues here before, Mr. Conroy. We have Kirk Tousaw, Barrister of Tousaw Law Corporation. So welcome to all three of you. We've got till 1:15 on this panel. If I could ask each of you to give opening comments of up to 7 minutes, and then we'll have questions from my colleagues and I. So I'll start in the order that I have you on the list. Mr. O'Hara.
Thank you. Thank you, Senators, for the invitation to speak to you today. My name is James O'Hara, and I'm the President and CEO of Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana. Before I begin my remarks, I would just like to say this is a very special day for me. On this very day in 1974, Victoria Day, the 24th of May, I first arrived in Canada from Scotland as a wee lad. I want to take this opportunity to recognize and sincerely thank Canada and the Government of Canada for welcoming me to this country as of this day, my home now, for 44 years. It is with humble gratitude I sit before you today and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about how we can make this wonderful country even better.
Accent, though.
A little bit. CFAM is a national nonprofit organization which has successfully represented medical cannabis patients since 2014. With a membership of over 20,000 Canadians, the organization has emerged as a thoughtful, legitimate, grassroots voice for medical cannabis in the nonprofit advocacy space. I'm a former bank vice president, and for many years now, I've also been a medical cannabis patient. I have a number of conditions which I successfully treat using medical cannabis, including focal seizures, osteoarthritis, and chronic asthma. The use of medical cannabis in my life has been utterly life-changing, and I mean life-changing. I've been able to reduce the number of seizures I have by about 80 to 90%, and my overall quality of life has increased dramatically, and I am far from alone in my experience. It's with this thought in mind around the legalization of recreational cannabis in C45 that it's important for us not to lose sight of the needs of patients. We have had a system of legalized medical cannabis in Canada for a number of years now, supporting patients with legitimate medical needs and who are treating their conditions and symptoms with the support of competent healthcare professionals. Now let me touch on some of the challenges. There are indeed challenges with the medical cannabis system, and a significant one is that many patients can't afford to get the medicine they need. As advocates for patients across the country, we want to make sure the government's move to legalize recreational cannabis doesn't compound or worsen these challenges medical cannabis patients already have and are struggling with today. Today, over 250,000 Canadian medical cannabis patients get relief of symptoms from various conditions and illnesses, including pain, headaches, anxiety, sleep disorders, MS, Crohn's disease, and epilepsy, just to name a few, which is why it's of critical importance that the ACMPR medical cannabis system be supported and continue into the future. In crafting Bill C45, we want to commend the government for recognizing the need to maintain a separate and distinct regulatory approach for medical cannabis, and we want to ensure that this is maintained. Beyond the government's constitutional requirements to provide reasonable access to cannabis for medical purposes, patients have unique considerations that can best be met in a distinct regulatory regime. Moving forward, beyond Bill C45, it is important that the government prioritizes and adequately supports the needs of patients by addressing their unique requirements. Among these requirements is the need for integrated end-to-end health care where a patient can have a conversation with their doctor all the way through to their pharmacist. Patients must be free to discuss medical cannabis as a treatment option with their primary care physician as they are with any other conditions today, while understanding any potential medical or medication interactions that they may face. In addition to the continuation of mail order today, we believe pharmacies should have the authority to retail medical cannabis, and further product forms should also be made available. Sales and consultation through pharmacies will help ensure that patients across Canada can access their medicine easily and can receive reliable education on the safe and effective use of medical cannabis from trained healthcare professionals with regulatory oversight. This is not only of significant importance today, but especially in the future as age demographics of our population dramatically change. Very soon, we will have more older Canadians than young, and this brings with it a seismic shift in healthcare needs for this country. You've already heard this morning, but let me underscore from a patient's perspective that affordability of medical cannabis remains an urgent crisis for the majority of patients, as fully 60% of these patients cannot afford their full dose. Insurers rarely cover the cost of medical cannabis, and the majority of patients' expenses are out of pocket. Again, this will become a critical demographic issue as more and more Canadians will be on fixed incomes. Also keep in mind, this is a medicine whose cost is already significantly burdened by HST, and it shouldn't be. Other medicines in Canada are zero-rated and not subject to any tax. And to compound this situation, just this week the government passed yet another tax for medical cannabis patients, an excise tax, or what is commonly described as a sin tax. To disincentivize the responsible management of someone's medical needs makes absolutely no sense, and applying a sin tax to syntax to medicine is completely out of line with our collective moral beliefs and principles as Canadians. It's important to recognize where cannabis tax revenue has been coming from up to this point, and that is medical cannabis patients. Essentially, the government is telling patients it wants them to pay excise and consumption taxes to help pay for education and enforcement for legalization of recreational cannabis. This is an unprecedented approach and wholly inappropriate for patients. Think this through. The government is funding education and enforcement to fight the opioid crisis, but they're not asking legitimate patients to use opioids to pay for those efforts. So why are they asking this of cannabis patients? Finally, on a related topic, affordability is one of the reasons why we also support personal production, and that is to give patients who struggle financially the option of producing their own medicine. I have three main asks today. One is that CFAM supports cannabis research and education initiatives. However, that should not be paid for on the backs of patients who are already carrying significant burdens today. Two, the government should do all it can to facilitate insurance coverage for medical cannabis. This is a big issue and confronts many, many patients today. Finally, remove all taxes for medical cannabis. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Next, we have Hilary Black, BC Compassion Club Society.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I am the founder of the first medical cannabis organization in the country, the BC Compassion Club Society, which was founded in 1997. In the interest of disclosure, I'm also employed with Canopy Growth, but I'm here today in my role as the founder of the Compassion Club. My remarks will focus on prioritizing and protecting critically and chronically ill Canadians through three recommendations. We will ask you to protect Canada's historical medical cannabis institution, the Compassion Club, to bring cannabis in all of its forms and potencies into the regulated market, and to remove the unjust taxes on medical cannabis. I have been publicly, safely, and responsibly retailing cannabis out of a storefront for over 20 years. The Compassion Club is a nonprofit society, and our model is unique. In addition to cannabis therapies, we have a subsidized wellness center. Last year, we provided 3,400 non-cannabis related holistic healthcare appointments, such as counseling and acupuncture and clinical herbalism, to some of Vancouver's most marginalized people, with little or no cost to our 11,000 members. Our clients often have multiple diagnoses, mental health issues, and substance abuse issues. They are falling through the cracks of the healthcare system until we catch them. We have developed the gold standard for medical cannabis education. We know how to maximize benefits, minimize risks, and avoid adverse effects, knowledge that is transferable to the recreational cannabis market. In 2002, I had the honor of testifying before the Senate Committee on Illegal Drugs and hosting that committee for a tour at the Compassion Club. Their report recommended the Compassion Club should be the standard for medical access and patient care across the country. Our model was enshrined into municipal bylaws by the City of Vancouver to encourage the replication of that model. Members of the task force, including the chair, Anne McClellan, visited the Compassion Club, and we are referenced as a model in that report. We worked with patient groups like CFAM to host a special meeting of patients for the task force, and partially as a result of that task force hearing directly from patients, the task force recommended the preservation of the medical system, which is absolutely the right thing to do, to encourage patients to use cannabis with the support of their healthcare professional. I was selected by Senator Nolan, may he rest in peace, to receive the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, acknowledging the work of the Compassion Club for its significant contribution to Canada. But today, the Compassion Club is facing extinction, as we do not fit into the regulatory framework of the ACMPR or this legalization bill. We have a massive responsibility to ensure the health care of our 11,000 members is not interrupted, and we respectfully suggest that you share that responsibility with us. Washington and Colorado have prioritized transitioning long-standing medical cannabis institutions into the regulatory framework, and we should be doing the same. The Compassion Club is a national treasure, and we ask that you recommend that the Compassion Club be given special consideration and protection, and we will work it out with the government and find a way to survive. We have risked arrest for decades, dedicated to patients, inspired by people like Greg Cooper. When I met Greg, he was 22, had severe multiple sclerosis, and could not put on his pants or feed himself until his tremors, muscle spasms, and pain were relieved through both inhaling and ingesting cannabis and potent cannabis products. Dan Hill, who was no longer with us, was diagnosed with HIV, hepatitis C, mental health issues, and substance use issues. He used potent cannabis products as a gateway out of his addictions to heroin, crack cocaine, and alcohol. He moved off the street into his own apartment, fell in love, and died a happy man. My grandmother, Jean Black, who's 102 in June, she uses a few drops of cannabis extracts in her tea instead of codeine to manage her arthritic pain, and it helped her with the side effects of the intensive radiation she had to heal the tumor in her throat. These are just a few stories of Canadians whose lives have been transformed by cannabis, and I have witnessed thousands of them. And they have asked me today to talk with you about potency and about tax. So there's one really important thing to understand when we're talking about potent cannabis products. Did you know that we have very few cannabinoid receptors in our brainstem? And the brainstem controls cardiac function and respiratory function. And what this means is that cannabis cannot cause death. So when we talk about overdosing on cannabis, it's actually very misleading because the word overdose implies that death is possible. When someone uses too much cannabis, the effects can be very uncomfortable. They can include nausea and vomiting and anxiety, but never death. Potent cannabis products allow patients to consume less plant matter to achieve the required effect and can be more cost-effective. For a recreational consumer, extracts can mean taking one inhalation of an elegant vape pen rather than smoking an entire joint. Potent concentrates, finished edible products, tinctures, topicals, resins, and suppositories must be brought into the legal market as soon as possible. Consumers will continue to access and use these products in an unregulated market. Your concerns will best be addressed by the production, distribution, and education occurring in a regulated market. Potency limits will not achieve the results that you're looking for. So potent cannabis extracts have not been responsible for a single death. Conversely, last year in BC, more people died from opioid overdoses than traffic accidents. One of them was my best friend's 18-year-old daughter. The Compassion Club has acquired tremendous experience with people struggling with substance use issues using cannabis as a harm reduction tool. We have witnessed cannabis being substituted for recreational and prescription opiates, cocaine, alcohol, and even fentanyl. As you know, the opioid crisis is a great public health emergency of our time. This country needs solutions now, and as you have heard, cannabis has great potential. So we implore you to vote yes to Bill C45 to accelerate the legalization of cannabis in all of its forms and potencies, and to invest in research into the potential role of cannabis as a part of the solution to this crisis. I was raised to believe that as Canadians, we use our power and privilege to protect those who are unable to defend themselves. We stand up for the rights of those who are being mistreated. I'm so disappointed this week that the House of Commons committee decided to maintain the excise tax on medical cannabis. The truth is that I'm ashamed of my country, that we're forcing patients not only to pay a sales tax, but a sin tax on their physician-authorized medicine. Some families are paying hundreds of dollars a month alone. We do not tax medical necessities in this country. So I ask you to please make us proud of our government's compassion and wisdom and remove the tax on physician-authorized medical cannabis. The world is watching us, and together we have an immense responsibility to get this right. We know the harms of prohibition are far greater than the risks of cannabis use. Prohibition laws have disproportionately affected Indigenous people, people of color, and other minority groups. Around the world, families are being torn apart, lives ruined, people jailed, and the futures of young people destroyed. You are a part of righting this great wrong, and I thank you for your diligent work. You can trust the Senate Committee report of 2002. You can trust the legalization task force process and report, and trust your amazing team at Health Canada working its way through these complex issues. So I ask you for three things. Protect Canada's historical medical cannabis institution. Bring cannabis in all of its forms and potencies into the regulated market as soon as possible, and remove the cruel tax on medical cannabis patients. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Finally, we have Kirk Tousaw.
Thank you, Honourable Senators. I'm here as an individual. I'm here as a medical cannabis consumer myself. I use cannabis on a daily basis for chronic pain and have since I was 30 years of age. I'm also here, I'd like to think, as a voice for the hundreds of people I've represented in the criminal and civil courts over the years of working in this field, victims of prohibition that did not deserve to be criminalized for their conduct. With that said, a brief history lesson. 16 years ago, the late progressive conservative Senator Pierre-Claude Nolan chaired the Senate Special Committee on Illegal Drugs, which issued a comprehensive 600-page report on the issue that currently occupies this body's deliberations. How should the Government of Canada deal with the issue of cannabis? I had the privilege of speaking with Senator Nolan many times about this, and he regularly reminded me that he'd come to the issue a staunch opponent of legalization. As a father, he said to me, he was mainly concerned about the impact on his children. Senator Nolan, however, allowed and indeed demanded that the committee use a rigorous review of the evidence to drive its conclusions. And there was much evidence. This Senate study remains one of the most comprehensive analyses of cannabis and cannabis policy ever conducted anywhere in the world. The report began by acknowledging that at its most basic, the discussion is really not about people consuming cannabis. Under prohibition, Canadians consume plenty of cannabis. We grow it, we sell it, and we consume it in vast quantities. As the committee pointed out, the issue is really about whether criminalizing millions of Canadians for those personal choices is good public policy. The committee grounded its analysis in principles that should serve as guides to this body. Good public policy should promote freedom for individuals and society as a whole. The proper role of the state is based on respect for autonomy and individual and societal responsibility. Ultimately, Senator Nolan and the rest of the 9-member committee determined in 2002 that criminalization was bad public policy and concluded, quote, the state of the knowledge supports the belief that for the vast majority of recreational users, cannabis use presents no harmful consequences for physical, psychological, or social well-being in either the short or long term. The committee also concluded that it was prohibition that actually caused the most harm to society. The main social costs of cannabis are a result of public policy choices, primarily its continued criminalization, while the consequences of its use represent a small fraction of the social costs attributable to the use of illegal drugs. Concluding that cannabis prohibition is harmful public policy, the committee recommended legalizing cannabis for Canadians over age 16 and granting amnesty to anyone previously convicted of simple possession. The committee's specific policy suggestion may seem familiar. Quote, the committee recommends that the Government of Canada amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to create a criminal exemption scheme This legislation should stipulate conditions for obtaining licenses as well as for producing and selling cannabis, criminal penalties for illegal trafficking and export, and preservations of criminal penalties for all activities falling outside the scope of the exemption scheme. Honorable Senators, this appears to be precisely what Bill C45 proposes to do, and the Government of Canada should be commended for now moving forward with reforming our cannabis laws. That said, I disagreed then and I disagree now that a criminal law-based approach is appropriate. At most, cannabis should be treated in the same general way we treat alcohol, a much more dangerous substance, a regulatory approach with extremely limited offense provisions. And I dare say that the Senate committee believed that any vestige of a criminal law-based regime should be extremely limited, because one of the report's guiding principles is that, quote, only offenses involving a significant direct danger to others should be matters of criminal law, end quote. In the intervening 16 years, we've learned much more about both the harms of prohibition and the impacts of legalization. We've seen experiments in legalization, both tacit and explicit, at home and abroad. We've had a system of legal access, including legal home production, of medical cannabis since 2001 in this country. We've had a system of commercial production and sale for medical purposes since 2014, which now has 300,000 participants. We've had a system of relatively open and widespread dispensary access in many major cities in Canada since 2014, and more limited dispensary access for more than 20 years. You can't walk 10 blocks in the city of Vancouver or downtown Toronto, or for that matter, Hamilton or Victoria or Seattle or Denver or Los Angeles without passing a storefront selling cannabis. These stores are selling, at least in Canada, so-called illicit cannabis openly and safely right now in almost every city and town in British Columbia and in most major population centers in every province in this country. This scares some people, and I understand that. Change is scary, particularly when you aren't familiar with the things that are changing. But I also understand that the evidence is clear that we have not seen and will not see the types of harms that so many seem to fear. Chaos does not reign in Vancouver. Every day you see people walking past dispensaries, and some going in the shop, just like they do every other store. 1 year after this change is implemented, I suspect we will mostly be wondering what all the fuss was about. I do have 4 specific recommendations. First, I want to reiterate my objection to a criminal law approach, because such an approach will continue to have significant negative external consequences, such as the continued disparate enforcement against visible minorities and those with less economic means. I hope that we move beyond this approach swiftly. But at the very least, we must be expunging criminal records for simple possession so that our previous bad laws are not anchors weighing down our fellow citizens' life prospects. We should also remove all criminal penalties in C45 associated with simple personal possession and production of cannabis. On that point, secondly, I want to emphasize that lawful personal gardens are critical aspects of this reform. Allowing commercial production and sale, but criminalizing people, Canadians, with penalties of up to 14 years in prison who want to grow the exact same plant for themselves at home, turns the point of legalization on its head. Legalization should and must be about not criminalizing individual Canadians for cannabis. The development of a vibrant industry will of necessity follow. Third, and as a parent of 4 children under 18, this comes from my heart. We must not criminalize young people in our pursuit of our laudable goals of trying our best to keep them safe and give them the tools they need to make responsible choices. We've tried the criminal approach. It isn't working now, and as the Senate committee determined, it is actually the single most significant source of harm from cannabis. A criminal penalty of up to 14 years in prison for a 19-year-old that shares a joint with her 17-year-old cousin is abhorrent and morally insupportable. Fourth, as we implement these changes, we must be looking for ways to transition the existing underground cannabis economy out of the shadows and into the light. This change is scary for them, too. Most, 95% of the domestic industry, are not involved with criminal gangs or violence in any way. I've represented hundreds of these folks over the years. They are small farmers, small shopkeepers, and people that love this plant. They are also a rich source of knowledge and experience, and let's be very blunt. If we don't bring them into the fold, many will likely to continue to operate outside of it. That is not good public policy. Finally, I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to address this critical issue. I also want to thank Canada for taking this step and bringing in legalization 1.0. It is not perfect, but it is an important first step. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And that completes our three panelist opening remarks. And now I'll go to my colleagues. Again, 5 minutes, questions and answers. So if the questions can be short and the answers short, you get more in. So, Senator Seidman.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you all very much for sharing your stories with us. Clearly personal, but as well as your expertise, and it's been helpful. Thank you. Perhaps Ms. Black, if I might ask you, because you did say that you are representing the BC Compassion Club Society, but then in full disclosure told us that you're also working for Canopy Growth. Yeah, so I thought that was particularly interesting. And so I'd just like to know, when did you accept a position with Canopy Growth?
I have been working with Canopy Growth for over 3 years. My position there is the Director of Patient Education and Advocacy, and at the same time I continue as the founder/mother of the Compassion Club, and I will always have a commitment to ensuring the continued care of the clients that I'm responsible to at the Compassion Club.
Great. It's interesting. Is it becoming then more common for patient advocates to take paid positions with cannabis producers?
I would say that many of the licensed producers are looking for people who have experience in educating and working with patients. When I was just listening to the pharmacist speak about the importance of having a pharmacist or a healthcare professional be the person dispensing cannabis, I would suggest that there is a very important role for a healthcare professional, but more importantly, what patients need is access to somebody who has an expertise in cannabis themselves. So people who have been distributing cannabis in civil disobedience, breaking these unjust laws until the country decided to start transforming them. There are employment roles for us, either with licensed producers or with specialized cannabis clinics. And in fact, there aren't enough of us, and that much of the experience and education that I have, I'm working on transforming that into education platforms through Canopy Growth, so that knowledge will be available on a much more broad scale.
Okay.
Even to the pharmacists, who I may suggest probably have a tremendous amount of learning to do about cannabis.
Okay, thank you. If I might, my time is short. I don't mean to cut you off or interrupt, but I did want to get to this excise tax issue because it's clearly an important one. And we're pre-studying C24, portions of it, in the Senate. And the amendment was not passed in the House of Commons, which would have exempted medical cannabis from the excise tax. And so what advice would you have for us here in the Senate now that we deal with the provision in the bill when it arrives?
My suggestion would be that I believe that the people in Health Canada and the people in the Canada Revenue Agency are very intelligent and will find a way to make a system work where patients can either get a refund in their taxes for the taxes that they pay, or there is a system where they are exempt from paying them in the first place. And I would suggest to you that from a moral and an ethical and a compassionate place, that this is one of the most important things that you can address. The tax on patients, the sales tax in itself is unethical and unacceptable, and I would say like borderline, like it doesn't comply with the essence of our tax laws.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I'd like to have somebody else's viewpoint on that. Perhaps Mr. O'Hara, if you could please.
Let me just add one important thing, and that is that understand the term medical cannabis. I just heard in the Finance Committee the other day MP O'Connell state that medical cannabis was already exempt from excise tax, and that therefore the amendment that the NDP had tabled was redundant. What's important to note is they're playing kind of fast and loose with the term medical cannabis. What a number of conversations I've had and a number of MPs have had, they're talking about medical cannabis in the context of Sativex, which is a prescribed medical cannabis derivative, but it's not medical cannabis per se. So I would urge everybody to understand that and not get confused if that comes up. And in essence, be prepared for those conversations that will definitely take place.
And so how should we deal with this provision in the bill?
Well, it's very, very, very simple. Medical cannabis, as authorized today, should be fully exempt from all taxes, especially excise tax. And what we need to recognize is that excise tax essentially is a compound tax. It's tax upon tax.
Yeah.
It's inherently evil, and that just shouldn't exist.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Dean.
Thank you. Mr. Tousaw, I'm picking up on your point about social sharing and the impact of, in terms of closeness of age, an individual sharing with a peer or relative. What would be your advice if we were to try to tackle that? What would be a straightforward means of just opening the door a little bit to some limited social sharing?
Let's be clear, I think C45 takes some steps in the right direction by not criminalizing young Canadians for possession of under 5 grams of cannabis. But you're precisely right to say this close in age issue is a very serious issue. I mean, my daughter, my eldest daughter, is 17. Her peer group includes people down to 14 years of age and up to 18, 19, 20 years of age. And it is perfectly normal behavior for young Canadians that are 19 to potentially use cannabis and share cannabis with their peers that might be under the legal age, under C45. We have a close-in age exemption to sexual conduct laws, for example, in the criminal code. And that type of close-in age provision, if you're within 2 or 3 years of the person you're engaged in the activity with, could easily be imported into this. But I think that doesn't necessarily go far enough, because one of the things this bill also does is it criminalizes a parent who would want to have their teenager, for example, use cannabis in the home as opposed to out with their friends or out at a party or something like that. I mean, with alcohol right now, you can allow your children to use alcohol in your home without fear of criminal penalty. And that makes sense. That's how you teach young people appropriate behavior. This sort of forbidden fruit idea actually drives people towards unsafe use of substances. We see it with alcohol. We see it with other substances. And so I think it's important to recognize that parents need to have an active and participatory role in their young person's development, in their children's development. I would much rather that my children are introduced to cannabis on my back deck by me than by a shopkeeper or by a peer driving around or at a party with other 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And we know they're doing it. Look, let's not pretend here. We have some of the highest youth rates of cannabis use in the Western world. That's not... And our kids are pretty good. They're doing pretty well. We have really good outcomes in this country for a lot of children. It's obviously socioeconomic dependent, as all things are. But we need to be sensitive to these kinds of issues, and we need to not be looking at people and saying, well, you could go to prison for 14 years if you pass a joint to someone in your peer group. That seems to me to be completely wrong-headed.
Thank you. Do you have time for one quick question?
Yes.
For Ms. Black? You mentioned concerns about placing potency limits and restrictions on high-potency cannabis products. At the outset of legalization in Canada, we would see only 2 limited products, dried cannabis and oil, both at the low end of the potency spectrum, I think it's fair to say. There have been some suggestions in discussions here that even those low-potency, limited initial product offerings should have potency limits imposed on them, possibly on an age basis. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the people will just consume more of the plant matter to achieve the desired effect. So you may end up inhaling 2 grams of cannabis in one sitting to try to obtain the desired effect, which is not in the interest of public health. When people are using potent flower or extracts that have been made, they're able to inhale or ingest a much smaller amount of the plant material to reach the desired effect. So in that way, potency limits are not going to achieve those goals of limiting the amount of THC or CBD that people are taking in. And then on the other side is that you will just be forcing people to continue to access the products that they want in an unregulated market. So the goal really is to bring all of the products in all of its forms and all ranges of potency out of the unregulated market and into the regulated market. When we're distributing cannabis in a regulated way, we have the opportunity to provide proper education. So at my Compassion Club, every patient gets an hour-and-a-half intake session, which I'm not saying is necessarily replicable in a retail environment, but that kind of knowledge that we have about how to teach people, either patients or recreational consumers, the safe place to start and how to slowly increase their dose until they reach the desired effect without any adverse effects, we can provide that kind of education in a regulated environment, and that's your best tool for avoiding the adverse effects that I believe you're trying to avoid through potential potency limits.
Thank you. I think you've given us good advice.
Could I just add?
Okay. Very quickly, please.
Yeah. We hear from patients constantly, especially patients who are suffering from MS spasticity or chemotherapy induced nausea. They need high THC. And the second aspect of that is the cost part of it. Even though it may be lower, then they're just going to consume more and more and more. So we're completely against that. We don't support THC limits.
Okay, thank you. Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for the presentation. Greatly appreciated. My first question is for Mr. Tousaw, if I'm saying that right. Okay. We heard a lot in committee talk a lot about the education on the risk associated with cannabis, but not so much on not nearly enough education on the consequence of the law. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to possession or home growth or age limit, in your opinion, are Canadians, young and old, well-informed, aware enough today of the consequences of C45? And if they're not fully aware of the consequences of C45, what could be the impact, in your opinion, on the juridical system?
I think that's a very insightful question, and I'd even broaden it further. Not only are Canadians not well aware of the impact of C45, Canadians aren't very well aware of the current laws surrounding cannabis. I cannot tell you how many people I talk to that think cannabis is legal right now. It's absolutely stunning. I talk to people that are in the regulated industry that don't know how the rule set works. The lack of knowledge, and look, it's complicated, right? I mean, you read legislation, you folks have all done it. It's not easy to do. You have to slog through it. It's referential. You have to think about it in a deep way. But there's a tremendous amount of confusion out there. And the problem with that is the legislation has so many sort of arbitrary limits that the people are going to just of necessity run afoul of it. For example, you're going to be allowed to possess 30 grams of cannabis, dried cannabis. And then there's this equivalency ratio that then applies to other cannabis products. So you're going to sort of have to do this math in your head when you leave your house. Well, I can bring 2 cookies with me, but not 4, because 4 means I'm breaking the law and 2 doesn't. Or I have this jar of cannabis here, and what? So I have to weigh it before I leave the house? It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's completely arbitrary. When you go to the alcohol store, I mean, you can go into the alcohol store and buy enough alcohol to kill a small town and put it in the trunk of your car and drive away. Mm-hmm. And what we depend upon is Canadians exercising individual responsibility. We don't depend on the government to say, well, you can only buy 6 beer at a time each day, or you can buy 6 beer now, and then you can go home and drop it off. You come back to the store and you can buy another 6 beer and go home and drop it off. But that's the system that we're going to have for cannabis, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why one of my recommendations to this committee is that all criminal penalties associated with personal, not commercial, with personal possession and production of cannabis should be eliminated from C45. Canadians deserve to stop being criminalized for their personal, individual choices. They deserve that from this committee and this government. That's the point of legalization. There also has to be education. Obviously, the government, I think Health Canada is doing a very good job so far of educating people at each step along the way what the changes look like and what the ramifications might be. But the best thing we can do for Canadians is just make it simple. You're allowed to possess cannabis. You're not allowed to unlawfully sell it. You're allowed to possess it. You're allowed to grow cannabis. You're not allowed to grow it, just like you can't make beer and sell it out your garage. You're not allowed to grow it and sell it out your garage. But you shouldn't risk going to jail for 14 years because you have 5 cannabis plants in your garden instead of 4. That just doesn't make much sense at all.
Thank you. Do I have more time?
Yep.
Okay, my next question is for Mr. O'Hara. I was wondering if you could do a comparison for us when it comes to access to medical marijuana for Canadians in needs. What will be the impact of C45 on the access of the medical marijuana? Will access be prevented? And in your opinion, would it put medical patients in need of medical cannabis in harm's way of turning to a different, less effective medication?
So there's a very short answer to that, and that is that C45 doesn't really affect medical cannabis patients directly. This is more about the recreational side. So the medical cannabis patients will still be able to access cannabis through the ACAPR system, which to this point remains unchanged, which is one of the points that we're advocating strongly, that continue on. But there's nothing in C45 for medical per se.
Do I have time?
Quick.
Okay. Mr. O'Hara, again, I understand that your organization has been working to get insurance companies to cover the medical cannabis. Can you give us an update or an overview of the status of this project? How many companies provide some coverage today, and are you optimistic that others will be following suit?
It's a great question. There are only a handful of companies that are providing coverage today, and it's important to note that they're providing coverage that is optional for that policy to be taken up. So just because they're enabling coverage doesn't mean to say that it's widely adopted. But there are some companies who have done that today. Sun Life is one, and there's a few others. I fully expect that to continue on, and there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of discussion around the topic within the industry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just follow up on that? Are there any provinces that are putting it onto their drug formulary in terms of coverage?
Good question. Not that I've heard.
Oh, okay. Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses. And, just quickly, Mr. Tousaw, following up on your comment in regards to the, confusion that's out there, I believe there's as many people confused as thinking that we're talking about decriminalization here instead of legalization with people that I talk to. And whether we're talking medical use. I'm just wondering, the C.D. Howe Institute has recommended that the government consider pardoning people previously convicted for cannabis possession and dropping any outstanding charges to free up much-needed resources for cannabis legalization. The government has said that they don't intend to pursue pardons at this time. I understand you've previously expressed your disappointment with this decision. Is there any reason why the government couldn't go ahead with some form of amnesty with legalization?
Great question, Senator. No reason whatsoever. There are literally thousands of pending simple possession cases in the criminal courts of this country sitting here today. People have been arrested to the tune of about 25,000 for simple possession per year while the Government of Canada is debating this legalization process and bringing it in. That is unjust. The Justice Minister can direct the Public Prosecution Service of Canada to discontinue all prosecutions for simple possession or any cannabis offenses at any time that the minister chose to do so. And I urge the minister to do that. We just had a Supreme Court of Canada decision in Jordan about excessive delay. We see an already overburdened court system creaking its way day by day into further decline. We don't have enough judges. Why are we spending scarce resources prosecuting people for simple possession of cannabis? We also know, by the way, that simple possession is enforced in a discriminatory manner against visible minorities and persons of lower socioeconomic status. This is an absolute unethical, immoral process. We should stop. We should have stopped a long time ago prosecuting simple possession. Senator Nolan's report came out in 2002. So I think it's an important step. But there's so much more we can do. And we can do it without legislative change. We can do it by policy.
Just yesterday, I believe there's people charged in my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador with possession of, and here we are debating this issue here.
Well, that's right.
But just as a quick follow-up, the government has spoken at length about how the Cannabis Act will crack down on organised crime. We've heard conflicting evidence on whether or not this will actually be effective. We've heard from many sides, many different stories. One of the ones that they keep using here over the past is what's happened in Colorado. Last night on the CBC National News, Briar Stewart did a report on what's happening in Colorado and the fact that the organised crime black market seems to be just gone out through the roof. There's so much of it down there. So I'm just wondering, maybe you could tell us, help us understand the different perspectives on the presence of organised crime in the illicit market. Who's currently supplying Canadians with illegal cannabis? Is this criminal gang activity on a large scale, as the government suggests? That's something that we need to be looking at here.
A huge misapprehension is that people involved in the illicit cannabis economy domestically in this country are connected to organized crime. The referenced earlier in the earlier panel, and I referenced in my comments, about 95% of the domestic cannabis industry is not what we normally think of as organized crime, criminal gangs, people that are engaged in the use of violence. Most people, and I've represented hundreds, if not over 1,000 people charged with cannabis offenses over the last 15 years. I can tell you that with very, very few exceptions, I would invite them home to my, and have invited many home to meet my family and sit at my kitchen table. They're good people. They're people that are otherwise law-abiding. I think using terms like crackdown is part of the problem. C45 is not going to crack down on organized crime. The only way, and I think the entire experience of Prohibition is evidence of this, the only way that you eliminate an underground economy in a product is that you make it lawful and that you make it easy for people to transition out of the very vibrant, very well-entrenched illegal economy that exists today, out of the shadows and into the light. And Health Canada, I think, has taken several steps in the right direction with the promulgation of micro-producer rules, micro-processing rules, and its policy decision not to automatically bar people with prior involvement from participating in the illicit industry. The individual provinces have taken varying approaches to that. British Columbia, I think, has said very explicitly, we're not having an automatic bar. On the other hand, Alberta's gone in the other direction. And so Alberta, with an otherwise, I think, very robust private retail system, has said, look, if you have any experience selling cannabis, you can't participate. Well, that seems to me to be a miss. Prohibition, criminal law penalties, including mandatory minimum penalties brought in 2012 by the former government of this country, have not made any impact in supply, consumption, or demand for cannabis in this country. Right? They don't reduce it. And so we can't criminal law our way out of this issue. We have to use common sense economic strategies. The illicit economy will go away when the licit economy is easy to participate in, carries the same range of products that the illicit economy does, and sells them with good customer service at good or better prices. That's how you get rid of the illicit economy. The idea that we're going to do it with a criminal law approach, I think, has proven to be a spectacular failure.
Okay, I have to move on. Sorry. Second round, sure. Senator McCallum.
Thank you for your presentations. This is for Mr. Tousaw. I was wanting to talk a bit more about the criminalization of the youth.
Yes.
And I agree with you with that, because marijuana is used by a lot of young people to, I'm from the reserve, it's to deal with the social issues that they have. And I don't know if you've read Gordon Cruz. He worked with a lot of juveniles that were in detention systems. And that he said, do not, and he interviewed former residents, and they said to him, don't criminalize the young, and to give them alternate programs. Can you speak a bit about that?
Well, I think that's very sensible. Let's just situate this. the use of cannabis by young people is part of growing up. It's normal,
it is.
standard behavior. Not for everyone, not for everyone, but for a substantial portion of our young people. They are going to use cannabis. They are going to use alcohol when underage. They're going to do these things. We can't stop that. So what can we do? Well, we cannot make the impacts of that use dramatically worse by also involving them with the criminal justice system. Involvement with the criminal justice system for simple possession of cannabis provides no benefit to the young person. In fact, it's all negative. You become fearful of police and resentful of police. You become entangled with the criminal justice system. You might have a lifelong criminal record. You might not be able to cross the border in the United States. Future employers might turn you down. There's a host of negative consequences that arise simply because we've chosen to label that normal behavior as criminal behavior. We need to take a different approach. Our young people are the most precious resources we have. I have 4 children between the ages of 7 and 17. You know what? I don't worry about the fact that they may try cannabis. What I worry about is the fact that they may try cannabis and then become arrested by a police officer and develop a lifelong aversion to going to the police when they're in need of them. And I was this 16-year-old. You know, I was arrested for simple possession of cannabis more than once. I developed a real antipathy to police officers, and it wasn't until I became a practicing lawyer and worked with them on a daily basis, in an adversarial capacity, granted, but on a daily basis, that initial sort of feeling went away. And I realized that these are, human beings like everyone else, trying to do a very difficult job. And in the area of substance use, they've been tasked with an impossible job. It's impossible. They should not be the frontline response to substance abuse. Parents, educators, and social workers should be the first line of response, not the criminal justice system.
Okay. This is for Ms. Black. I was very encouraged with your club. You had said that you developed a gold standard for education, and coming from First Nations where there's a lot of addictions, and I'm wondering if you could share a bit of that with us.
Certainly. Well, first of all, it's about spending the time that the Compassion Club has the capacity to spend an hour to an hour and a half to every new client that comes in on a one-on-one education session. So that's a choice about making the investment of spending the staff time to do that. And over the years, we developed systems for teaching people how to start using cannabis very safely and to avoid their adverse effects. So when you're inhaling cannabis, it's actually easier to avoid adverse effects because you feel the effects right away. So you have a little inhalation off your vaporizer, you wait a minute or two, you decide if you want to take a little bit more, you have another puff, and you can feel the effects. When we ingest cannabis, it takes much longer for the onset of the effects because it has to be digested through our GI tract before it gets into our bloodstream. So when people are eating cannabis products is when we have to give them a lot of education. And when people say they eat a piece of a cannabis edible product, and 2 hours later they don't feel any effects, and so they eat some more. We call that cumulative dosing, and that's where they might feel the effects of both of those doses at once. And this is what the kids call greening out, which is where you might get a bit pale, and you feel nauseous, and you might feel anxious, and you might even vomit if it's a serious case. So when we're dealing with elders and people or seniors or people with very sensitive systems, it's really important that we avoid that. So in the old days, we didn't have access to laboratories because we were breaking the law and there weren't laboratories that would work with us, so we didn't have precise measurements so we would tell people to, say if they had a cookie, to take one little bite. And then wait until the next day to try taking more. Wait for a whole 24 hours. So now in the modern cannabis world, we do have access to laboratories. So if I'm dealing with somebody who's brand new to using cannabis, I will tell them if they need THC, if they're looking for, say, pain control, that they take equal amounts THC and CBD to balance them together, and you start at 2.5 milligrams, which is a very small amount. And then I encourage people to wait 24 hours before they increase by 2.5 milligrams. And this system can pretty much guarantee that it's going to avoid adverse effects. And it's the same kind of knowledge that we can easily translate to the recreational market when it comes to using potent products, about how to use them in a very safe way where you start slow and you go very slow but in a precise, measured way, and people will learn what the amount is that they need for the desired effect while avoiding any of the adverse effects.
Okay, thank you.
One quick sentence.
Very quick.
That's not really any different from how we deal with other medicines, right? I mean, your doctor will prescribe you a painkiller and say, take one, and if it works, don't take two. And if it doesn't work, maybe the next day, try taking two, up to a maximum.
Okay.
We're familiar with this.
Thank you. Senatrice Meiji.
My question is, first of all, for Ms. Black. Why do you say that the Compassion Club is going to be jeopardized with the legalization of marijuana? Because you provide a service to people at the end of the day. And so why do you feel threatened by C45?
Thank you for your question. So the way that we have created the medical stream currently is through the licensed producers and through distribution of cannabis through the website and the mail order system. So the Compassion Club is a community center. It's a storefront. It's still engaged in civil disobedience 20 years later. I mean, we try to be lawful and to obey, bylaws and to be as lawful as we possibly can. So in Bill C45, there is no provision for a community center that takes care of patients. So we could pursue getting a recreational license from the province, but in that case we would not be able to supply all of the edibles and extract products that our patients rely on. And so we're in a place where we're going to be forced to continue to break the law to ensure that the medication that our patients are depending on is not interrupted until the time that that law changes. So there is currently no licensing scheme under either the ACMPR or Bill C45 that is going to allow us to legally continue to provide the, in some cases, life-saving health care that we're providing to our clients. And so when I ask what can you do to help protect this organization, really what I think you can do is make a recommendation in your report to the government to find a way to give special status and protection to this organization, and we will work with Health Canada and find a way to creatively find licensing so that we can do what we're doing in a legal environment. And you need to bring edible products and extracts into the regulated market so that we don't have to continue to risk criminalization to provide the medicines that our patients require.
How do you understand that dispensaries that will no doubt multiply exponentially with the adoption of C45, they don't have the same problem because their operations will be legalized? Could you not go through the same path as they? Focusing more on services to patients, is that possible? I don't even know if it's possible.
It is possible. We could apply for a provincial license, in which case we would be agreeing to no longer distribute finished edible products or any of the inhaled or ingested extracts because they're not in the legal market. And also the way that British Columbia is proposing to do supply is that they're going to have a central warehouse where the licensed producers supply this central warehouse, and the dispensaries will be able to purchase from that warehouse. And I do not have faith that that system is going to be able to do appropriate quality control and maintain the quality of this perishable product. I just don't believe that we're going to be able to maintain the quality of medicine, and definitely not the selection of products that patients are requiring.
Merci. Let me, do you have another question? No? Oh, okay. Let me just follow up on that. You've existed for 20 years. Obviously, that's with some agreement or tolerance from local authorities who must think you're doing a good job. So why should you now suddenly feel threatened? You don't necessarily have to go into the mold. You haven't been in the mold for 20 years, so why would you think
That-
And let me also ask you, how many other compassion-type clubs are there aside from yours? Is it widespread? Or?
You know what? There are other excellent medical cannabis dispensaries that focus on patients, but what makes the Compassion Club very special is that all of the profits go to funding our wellness center. So people are using cannabis therapies in conjunction with a counselor and a nutritionist and an herbalist and an acupuncturist, and these services are being provided to people who are usually living in dire poverty and are often minority and marginalized. So this is the way that we are catching people that are falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. So there is, to my knowledge, no other organization that operates in the same way that the Compassion Club does across the country. And as we are evolving our legislation around cannabis, we have offered our expertise to the Parliamentary Health Committee and to the Senate, and every time we have an opportunity to come and help this government to shape the progress around the evolution of cannabis laws, we do that. And we don't want to continue breaking the law. We want to be legal, we want to be licensed, but we will be forced to continue to break laws until such time as all of the products that patients are requiring are legally brought into the regulatory framework.
Okay. That completes round one. I have a question for Mr. Tousaw before I go to round two. What you're saying about removing criminal penalties for simple possession, I totally agree with that, particularly as it relates to our young people. But you and others have pointed out this whole question of social sharing, 19-year-old with 17-year-old, and all those combinations, or they, you can end up in the youth criminal court with more than 5 grams, and yet an adult can have 30 grams. We've got all those things about close in age, social sharing, etc. Now, one point of view is, and I know a lawyer would never consider this acceptable, but one point of view is that they would never actually be prosecuted. That those kind of prosecutions would not take place, even though technically they are a violation of the law. Technically, if you, in some cases, it could be a fine, but it could eventually lead either in the youth criminal court system or the adult criminal court system. It could lead to something more than that. So what do you say to that? That oh well, there's nothing to worry about here.
Well, I have a two-part answer to that. The first part is that it's a common misconception that simple possession cases are currently not prosecuted in this country, and yet 26,000 people a year end up prosecuted for these offenses.
A lot of them minorities.
Well, and that's the second part of my question. Yeah. Is my child, white, privileged, with a lawyer for a father, going to get prosecuted? No. But you know what? That's not good enough, because we know that these laws are applied in disproportionate manners against marginalized people, against visible minorities, against people of different socioeconomic status. And so I don't think it's acceptable that some people, like my children, like Mr. Trudeau's brother, get to escape criminal prosecution because of what they look like or their connections, and while others who don't have those connections, who don't look that way, end up in the criminal justice system. That's what we see today. That's what we're going to see in the future. Disparate enforcement of these laws, and it is absolutely unacceptable in a free and democratic society.
Okay, round two. We've got 7 minutes. Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, my question was asked, and I believe, Mr. O'Hara, you answered it because it was about the insurance companies. So, yeah, so I'm okay. Thank you.
So you gained some time.
Yeah. So all is well now. I just wanted to be clear, but that's okay.
All is well in terms of the answer.
Right.
Still a lot of work to do in that area.
Well, there's no question about that.
Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, thank our witnesses. I'm a big supporter of decriminalisation, not necessarily of legalisation. I wanted to follow up with questions I was asking you before, Mr. Tousaw, in regards to the possibility of different provinces having some different rules. As I watch in Colorado as an example of some of the concerns that are in that area is the fact that Colorado has legalization while the next state may not. Quebec, from what we hear, is not going to allow homegrown, where New Brunswick is. You mentioned about British Columbia versus the storefronts in Alberta.
Yes.
I'm just wondering from a legal point of view what your concerns would be in relation to the fact that we're going to have a national law, C45, but we're going to have provinces that are going to have different jurisdictions that we do, but are we going to have concerns from province to province interrelated?
I think we are, and I always like to divide this issue into two different things, commercial versus consumer, right? The business plan, the commercial regulation, I have concerns about, but the Como case in the Supreme Court of Canada made clear that provinces are entitled to regulate differently than each other and even to impose certain barriers on interprovincial trade. And I don't think we're going to see another challenge to that provision for a good long time. My difficulty is on the consumer side, on the individual side. Look, on the commercial side, I think I have preferences. I think private retail is better than public monopolies. I think it makes a lot more sense. I think we're going to end up there eventually. We're going there for alcohol. It just makes more sense. But on the individual side, it's absolutely inappropriate to legalize personal production of cannabis across this country, and the federal government in this country is the sole source of criminal law jurisdictionally. But Quebec to step in and say, well, this behavior that's otherwise lawful in the rest of the country, we're going to punish you for. We're going to criminalize this conduct as a province. Not only is it wrong-headed, because it's going to lead to the continuation of the problems that prohibition causes, but I just think it's not fair. Why should someone, 1 foot across a line, be able to grow 4 plants perfectly legally, and the person on the other side of that line, and maybe even be neighbors, can't do that, and the police could come in and arrest them for it? That is absolutely inappropriate. It should not be tolerated, and quite frankly, I think ultimately the courts are going to resolve that portion of the issue. I don't think it's constitutional for a province to criminalize otherwise lawful behavior that's lawful across the rest of the country. And if I spoke French better, maybe I'd take a case like that. But unfortunately, I don't.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's fine.
All right. Okay. Senator McCallum, you have another question.
I wanted to ask you if you feel that the excise tax and the criminalization of youth, would you say that's discriminatory?
Well, I think it is, particularly the excise tax. I join with everyone you've heard today to say applying an excise tax to medical cannabis. And let's be clear, it's not currently applied to medical cannabis. So we are adding a tax to sick and suffering citizens' burdens. So we should not be doing that. But any of these policies, just because of the way our society is structured and the institutionalized racism that we have and the institutionalized socioeconomic discrimination that we have, any of these issues are magnified when applied to people of marginalized groups, visible minorities, and people of lower socioeconomic status. Taxes hurt those folks more than they hurt people with means. I can pay the extra $1 a gram, even for my medical cannabis. I can afford it. But a lot of people can't. And we should be concerned more about those people than about people like me that aren't going to have these kinds of difficulties. And the same is absolutely true of every other aspect of taking a criminal law approach to this issue.
Okay. Anybody else? No? All right. We're finished. So
I got a lot more I could say.
Okay. Well, the Senate is meeting in another 15 minutes, so we time to wrap up. So I want to thank the three panelists that we've had in this second panel. You've been most helpful to us, and appreciate the answers you've given to our questions. And colleagues, before you leave, I would remind you that we are back again tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. We have 8 a.m. We have 4 hours of dialogue with various officials on the 4 reports that came from the other committees. I also want to remind you that any amendments or observations to the bill, because on Monday at 3 o'clock, I think it is, we start at 1 o'clock on Monday, but we have an hour and a half with Mr. Blair and officials from Health Canada. But then at 3 o'clock, after a half-hour break between that session and clause by clause, we go into clause by clause. So amendments and observations, remember the request is they must be in both languages, and they to fit the format of the clause provisions of C45, they must meet that provision. You can't just have a general wording. It's got to meet the provision that goes into the bill, and that's why we suggested you consult the law clerk with respect to that. Those are due by 4 p.m. Tomorrow, so that we can get them all sorted out and get them ready for Monday. And we'll be getting them on the weekend, so there won't be much of a weekend break, but we'll be ready to go on Monday. So please remember all of that. And so this meeting is now adjourned. We'll see you at 8 a.m. tomorrow.